This story is about a lone adventurer who broke a taboo. This adventurer ate like an animal. Several monsters lay on the ground with a young man standing over them. His arm was completely injured, and he stopped eating. A light began to envelop his body. Quickly, all the wounds on his body started to heal. The system notified him that some skills like Roar and Battle Axe had been acquired. The protagonist started to scream as a strong aura took over the place. There were several other creatures nearby watching everything unfold. A nobleman's journal said that devouring monsters is a taboo in this world. The monsters began to surround the young man, and they started to attack. For a human, devouring monsters meant absorbing their evil essences. The first symptom appeared upon absorption, an indescribable feeling of frenzy accompanied by superhuman strength. The second was severe headaches and nausea, followed by poisoning. The monsters kept appearing, but the young man showed no fear. The third symptom is sudden death. While the monsters attacked him, the protagonist only thought about getting revenge for everything. Rage took over his eyes and emotions. If one could endure all this, they could become a monster. After consuming the evil essence, the young man began to defeat all the creatures as if they were nothing. He kept hitting, fighting, and devouring everything that moved around him, acquiring more and more skills. This cycle repeated many times. After defeating everything in his path, the protagonist reached a large serpent. Driven by rage and armed with many acquired skills, he began a fierce battle with the serpent. It tried to bite him, but he was able to defend himself and quickly use his lightning ability called Thunder Cloak. A huge electrical discharge struck the serpent, which couldn't withstand such a powerful blow. The boy acquired another skill called Poison Mist. He continued to defeat and devour the monsters, growing stronger each time. Tired of the constant fighting, he stopped for a moment, thinking that maybe with all this he could survive. However, he heard another sound, and when he looked up, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Several other creatures appeared before him. This time, he was surrounded by many monsters. He looked at them all and said that it didn't matter how many he had to defeat. He would survive no matter the cost. This is the future of the protagonist, the monster-devouring adventurer. Currently in Biona, a border city with multiple dungeons, there is one called the Miasma Dungeon. The air inside this dungeon continuously degrades the stats of the adventurers who visit it. The protagonist was walking through it, thinking that other people hated that place, but he always visited it. Before he knew it, they were already calling him the Miasma Butcher. He looked at the ground and was glad to see there was quite a bit of grass. This was the 6th floor of the dungeon. He begins to harvest them. These are miasma herbs. They have the effect of purifying the dungeon and are also a source of money for the protagonist. He starts to sum, thinking he won't gather much, just what he needs. After harvesting them for about 3 days, he suddenly hears some noises and turns around, seeing a group of rats. He thinks they are the dungeon rats. The young man starts running toward the rats. Many of the monsters here use poison as an attack, which is why adventurers don't like this place. However, for him it made no difference. The protagonist crosses the curtain of poison, leaping directly at the rats. He easily takes down all the rats present, but out of nowhere, more rats appear, jumping toward the boy. He wastes no time in counterattacks, defeating another rat. However, another one was already too close, and he could only defend himself with his arm as the rat tried to bite him. The rat was getting closer and closer to hurting the protagonist, but at the last second, he hears someone shout. A fireball hits the rat, throwing the boy aside. He falls to the ground, looking at the explosion, surprised by everything. As he looks to the side, he sees some people who claim they got lost. One adventurer tells the younger one that he had told him to watch out before firing the attack. The protagonist isn't too happy to see the familiar faces from the Adventurers Guild. One of the young men approaches the protagonist and apologizes, asking if his name is Rude, emphasizing that he only tried to help since it looked like Rude was in danger. Rude gets up and thanks him, asking the young man to warn him before doing something like that again. The boy is confused and says that's exactly what he did when he shouted, "Fireball." While they were talking, the chubby guy shouted that the grass colony was really there. He smiles and says it's a stroke of luck. The other two are happy to hear that, but the protagonist is in shock. He asks if the 3 of them have been following him to find his gathering spot. The boy asks what he's talking about, since they're just adventurers trying to make a living in a dungeon. He points out it was just a coincidence that they ran into him and then saved him. They shout that this was what was expected from the Miasma Butcher. Can't he just thank them? The 3 of them begin to prepare for a fight. Rude notices this and closes his eyes. Even though he's irritated, he begins to apologize for doubting them and thanks them for saving him. His hand trembles with rage. Sometime later, in Bologna, at Rude's base, the Full Belly restaurant, the protagonist is being thrown across the tables. 2 men are insulting him, saying that every time he comes in, the smell ruins the food and that they had to say this because he was too dumb to notice. Rude is on the floor and the 2 of them continue to mock him. The blonde man says that adventurers are people with the skills to defeat monsters. They start laughing as they claim that a person with such a useless skill as abnormal status nullification is good for nothing. The protagonist looks at them in disgust for everything they said. Abnormal status nullification is Rude's unique skill. It's useful for exploring the Miasma Dungeon, but it's not suited for defeating monsters, which is vital for any adventurer. And since he has no combat skills, Rude isn't accepted into any party. This is how he earned the nickname Miasma Butcher, since he's always on the lower floors looking for items. Rude leaves the restaurant because thanks to this weak skill, he has become a renegade adventurer. The protagonist thinks that even though he's a grown man, he still has life or death battles with simple rats. Lying in his bed, lost in thought, he wonders if he'll really spend his whole life just being the Miasma Butcher. The next day, at the Adventurers Guild, Rudy opens the door, thinking he needs to find another colony while he still has some money left. As he walks through the place, the protagonist notices it's noisier than usual. He approaches the receptionist and asks her if there are any good requests for today. With a downcast look, she tells him that a new dungeon has been discovered. Rudy is a bit surprised by this news, because new dungeons are filled with treasures and magic items. It's a golden opportunity for any adventurer. He looks around and thinks that now it makes sense why there are so many people here. The guild receptionist calls him over and shows him that the herbs he used to bring in are now only worth 30 because the price has dropped. He looks at it, yells at her, and asks why. She explains that the Miasma Dungeon was never popular, and now that people are focused on the new dungeon, there won't be any demand for those herbs. The protagonist can't believe it. The girl also says that the new dungeon is located in the mountains, but Rudy isn't allowed to go there. He asks her why. She shows him that the requirement to enter is rank D or higher, and, since Rudy is rank E, he doesn't qualify. This frustrates him. He yells at her, saying he wants to at least take a look at the dungeon, asking if there's anything he can do. The girl sighs and says that, unfortunately, those are the rules, and adds that even if he went there, he would only meet his end. Still, Rudy is upset about this. Suddenly, someone arrives and says that if he's that eager to go, he could join the party as a porter. The boy looks at him with a smile on his face. After everything is settled, they take a carriage that leads them down a road. The party leader smiles and says it's great to have found the protagonist, as he had been looking for someone to carry the items from the dungeon, but no one wanted to do it. Rudy looks at him dejectedly, thinking that this is because all the adventurers in the guild are gathering to see the new dungeon, which makes it hard to find a porter. Suddenly, the red-haired woman starts to wonder if it really had to be the butcher. The man agrees with her and asks if there wasn't anyone better. The leader tells everyone to stop, saying that the protagonist is a veteran adventurer, and it's better to take him than a beginner. He starts to introduce himself, saying that his name is Beer and that he's the leader of the Scarlet Blades. They also introduce the other two, saying they are Sasha and Rick. Together, the three of them form a rank D party. The protagonist looks at them and also introduces himself, saying his name is Rudy. He says it's a pleasure to work with everyone there. Beer says that before they go in, he'd like to take a closer look at the protagonist's stats and asks him to show his guild card. Rudy says that's no problem. As soon as he takes the card, Beer asks him to open his status, and a window appears that shows his specs. Beer is surprised and asks if Rudy can use fire magic. Rudy says yes, but that it's too weak to be used in battle, though it's good enough for cooking. Beer smiles and says that it's quite useful, and that's why he'll trust him. After the journey, they arrive at the dungeon and are impressed. The leader says they finally arrived. This is the new dungeon. Sasha is very happy and Rick is excited. She says that it looks like they were the first to arrive. Rick can barely wait and asks them to go explore immediately. They slowly open the door and start to look around. However, as soon as they look, they see several people inside. There were people in front, people to the right, people to the left, and everywhere there were more and more people. Sasha yells that there are adventurers everywhere. Beer looks at all this and says it seems like the first floor has already been explored. Sasha continues, irritated, saying that they didn't arrive first after all. Rick says that's easy to fix, they just need to go a little deeper, since there should be fewer people there. She gets excited and says he's right. Rudy says it's not a good idea, as this is a newly discovered dungeon and that they should map the first floor first. However, they look at him and she asks if he heard the porter give his opinion. Rick says that's why he's still at his rank. He tells them both to stop, emphasizing that the protagonist didn't say that with bad intentions. He says that, even so, he agrees with the others, because if things continue like this, they won't get good results. They look at the descent, saying they need to move quickly. With that, they begin to descend and reach the fourth floor. A wolf charges at them and the group gets scared. However, Rick steps in and defeats the wolf. He turns to the protagonist and tells him to stop being afraid of those small fry. Sasha shows no mercy and uses her magic to defeat those creatures. Beer defeats everything that comes near him. Rudy watches the three of them, impressed by their strength. He tries to grab his sword, but can barely move due to fear. Before he can do anything, all the monsters had already been defeated. The leader sheathes his sword and lets out a sigh of relief. Sasha is happy with the rewards and says they did the right thing by going deeper, since it's great without the others around. Beer looks at his ring and says the monsters here aren't very strong, but they still manage to find some good treasures. Suddenly, Rick yells at the protagonist, telling him to also collect the materials from the monsters he defeated. Rudy says there's no way he can collect materials from those monsters because they're too damaged, including their magic stones. Rick asks how he knows that if he hasn't looked and tells Rudy to stop being a butcher and a slacker. The protagonist gets irritated, remembering how Rick had been acting, and, even with his hand trembling with anger, says he'll collect them. Rudy approaches one of the monsters and thinks that it's badly damaged and smells awful. He wonders if Rick really had to go that far. The protagonist uses his fire magic and begins, thinking it would be easier if it just burned a little. Rick continues to mock him, saying that Rudy started roasting the monster, asking if he was going to eat it. Suddenly, he says they've been exploring for a long time and that he's starving. The monsters actually look pretty good. Sasha tells him to stop because it's disgusting, as he would absorb its mana and nobody knows what could happen. Rick says that it was just a joke and he's going to eat a lot with the money they've earned. Suddenly, a crushing pressure accompanied by a loud noise fills the area, leaving everyone there terrified. Right in front of the four of them, a huge monster appears. It's a minotaur. Road worries because it's a B-rank monster and shouldn't be on this floor. They start to scream that they won't be able to defeat it and ask what they should do. Bayer yells at the protagonist that he's going to use the items and asks for the bag. He grabs the bag and tells Rudy to watch the monster's movements. The protagonist asks if the leader has a plan. Beer starts to laugh and says yes, preparing to attack, emphasizing that he has a great plan. Beer betrays the protagonist and hits him. While Rudy is lying on the ground, the leader calls out to the other two. Rick throws a spear called the Warrior's Mantle. This is a warrior's taunt skill that makes the target attract the monster's attention. The spear lands next to the protagonist. Sasha uses acceleration on everyone. This is a skill that doubles the target's speed. Almost powerless, lying on the ground, Rudy asks if they had planned to do this from the beginning. The leader, smiling, asks if there was any other reason for them to bring a butcher along with them. The protagonist watches them as they run away, yelling at him to buy time. Filled with rage, he screams, cursing all of them. The Minotaur prepares to attack him. The protagonist looks at him, and the monster looks back. With all its might, it attacks and throws Rudy far away. He crashes against the wall and smiles, thinking that he managed to dodge it. However, he sees the monster approaching him and thinks this is the end. The Minotaur hits him with all its strength, making him feel an incomparable pain. The wall behind him cracks from the force of the blow, and they both fly through to the other side of the wall. The monster also gets worried when it sees that they are both falling into a giant hole. After the fall, Rudy opens his eyes, all battered and confused. He wonders if he is still alive. He looks to the side and sees that he landed on top of the monster. The protagonist thinks that, even so, he doesn't have much time, because even if no monsters appear, he's too injured to get out of there. Hunger begins to take over his body. He needs to eat something. Still on top of the Minotaur, he gets lost in his thoughts and swallows, his mouth watering. He starts to laugh, wondering what he's thinking, since eating monsters can only end badly. Rudy closes his eyes, thinking about how terrible his life has been, but then he starts to see a light and a person speaking to him. The person says that no matter how hard life gets, he should never give up. Without hesitation, he begins to eat the monster piece by piece. He thinks that if a human without magic eats monster meat rich in magic, the monster's particles will invade his body. Monsterification. The protagonist thinks that this is a terrible fate, worse than dying from poison. His eyes begin to change color and a dense aura starts to take over his body, but he doesn't stop. He keeps cutting the monster's flesh. His arm is completely shattered. That's why it's a taboo. To recover from his injuries and satisfy his hunger, Rudy made a risky gamble that resulted in an unexpected mutation. In the dungeon's corridors, a noise is heard from the sleeping monsters. Begin to awaken, they got up and saw something terrifying moving where it shouldn't be. Rudy is walking like a ghost, his eyes glowing as rage takes over his body. The bats try to attack him, but he uses his brute strength, intimidating his opponents. With a powerful roar, the bats don't stand a chance. However, more appear. This time, the protagonist uses physical reinforcement, a skill that enhances the user's physical strength temporarily. He begins to pulverize everything that approaches him. Driven by rage and hunger, he defeats all the monsters and continues to devour them. Now, Rudy has the skill of echolocation, which allows him to detect nearby creatures and is effective in the dark. Various other monsters of all kinds begin to approach. However, the protagonist can now hear and locate all of them. He is surprised when he realizes they are coming in hordes. This excites Rudy, making him eager to see who will devour whom. The protagonist charges at the monsters, defeating everything near him. He grips his axe tightly, thinking that it fits perfectly in his hand and that he can now sense monsters without using magic. Rudy continues this relentless battle, and he devours everything he can eat without hesitation. After the fight, the protagonist gasps for air and starts to laugh. His clothes and wounds begin to heal immediately. He believes that every time he eats a monster, he feels power coursing through his body. Thirsting for more power, he continues his hunt, destroying any monster that crosses his path, all while smiling. After a long time of fighting and walking, he opens the door and starts to leave. Seeing the ray of sunlight, he freezes and drops his axe to the ground, smiling because he's finally back. Rudy shouts, happy that he managed to survive. Meanwhile, at the Adventurers Guild, people are anxiously talking amongst themselves. The party known as the Scarlet Blades is giving their report. An old man says that after hearing their report, he decided to gather all the adventurers who were in the dungeon, except for Rudy, who was with the other three. This man is the guild master, Bellona, and his name is Landbeer. He pretends to be sad, saying that as soon as they encountered a minotaur on the 4th floor, Rudy was attacked before they could do anything. Sasha also puts on a show and pretends to cry, saying if only they had seen the monster sooner. Lankar says he understands the situation and then declares that from now on, entering that dungeon is forbidden. The receptionist is sad, but then she is shocked by what she sees before her. The protagonist opens the door, leaving everyone present in shock. People begin to wonder what happened. The three members of the Scarlet Blades and the guild master are completely stunned. They rushed over and shouted. Fire is happy that he's alive. However, he approaches the protagonist and tells him that if he opens his mouth, he won't be so lucky to stay alive. The others get to him, asking if he's all right and telling him they tried to go back to help, but the dungeon was sealed. They touch the protagonist, but he remains silent. Fire shouts that it doesn't matter how, just that Rudy is okay, and this calls for a celebration, but it can't be here. Fire tries to push the protagonist, but is surprised when he realizes he can move. Rude yells that the three of them use him as bait, which surprises everyone. Beer tries to deflect the situation and asks what he's talking about. The guild master asks what the protagonist meant by his statement. Rude begins to explain that Beer stole the supplies and attacked him from behind. Rick used a skill to direct the Minotaur toward the protagonist, while Sasha sped them up to flee, leaving him behind. Beer shouts, trying to deny it. Suddenly, a woman begins to enter the guild, saying she will clear up the story. Everyone watches her enter the building, as she is an official from the Department of Truth. The three of them are shocked and ask what an official from the Department of Truth is doing here. Lancaster says it's because numerous porters joined their team and were never seen again, which is why he brought her to settle the score. The guild master tells her to proceed, and everyone is afraid, except for the protagonist. She asks between Beer's group and Rude's group, who is telling the truth. Her eyes begin to glow, and seconds later, she declares that the members of the Scarlet Swords are lying. The woman raises her staff and announces that Rude is telling the truth. Beer is terrified by this. The other adventurers begin to whisper among themselves in disgust. Despite all this, Beer refuses to accept it and asks how they knew. Linos explains that the truth ability is impossible to acquire after reaching adulthood and its effectiveness rivals unique skills. The lies didn't get past the truth ability. The guild master asks what could be more trustworthy than the words of someone who swore to dedicate all their power to the nation. Beer is left speechless, trembling in fear. Lancaster shouts that abandoning comrades is a taboo for adventurers. Furthermore, the three of them injured their companion and used him as bait to escape. Lancaster says that even without investigating their other crimes, this is enough to revoke the three of their adventurer licenses and reduce them to servants. Sasha starts screaming in outrage at this. Rick can't believe it. Beer begins to tremble with rage. He never imagined that someone like him would end up as a mere servant. He looks at the young woman next to him, irritated, thinking that if it weren't for them. Filled with rage, he attacks the girl. The master and the staff members see this. The young woman is startled. Without a second thought, Rude moves quickly and gets in front of the girl, defending her from the attack. The protagonist looks directly at Beer and tells him to never dare touch an official of the truth again. Beer is shocked by the protagonist's strength and speed. Rude lands a blow on him, sending him flying several feet away. Beer crashes into the wall with so much force that he shatters it, drawing the attention of everyone passing by. Sasha and Rick are frozen in fear at the sight. Rude says that wasn't right. Once everything calms down, Lancaster takes the protagonist to the guest room and apologizes for the trouble, saying he must be tired. Rude says he's fine and asks what happened to the three of them. Lancaster explains that the three were captured by his team and will now be interrogated. If it's confirmed that they are responsible for incidents where they use porters as bait, they will lose everything and be reduced to servants. However, Beer was too far by trying to attack a truth official, and it's likely they'll never be seen again. The protagonist is shocked by this. Cars points out that the three of them lost their rights to the profits they made in the dungeon, so Rudy will get to keep everything. The master says there are about 200,000 Regan inside. After they finish talking, the protagonist leaves the room and stands in front of the door holding all the money in his hands. Rudy happily hugs the money, thinking that this will cover some of his expenses. He thinks it would take a long time to gather that amount, even if he collected a little each day. Rudy never imagined he could earn so much money as an adventurer. He starts walking and notices something strange. The protagonist believes everyone stopped insulting him because they saw what happened earlier, but that doesn't mean they'll be friendly. He keeps walking, thinking that if he continues to evolve this way, people will start to suspect him. So, he decides to try his luck in the miasma once more. Like before, the protagonist takes a deep breath and thinks that it's time to take action and stop being negative, because he'll finally have some money and can buy equipment and eat whatever he wants. While walking through the town, Rudy decided to check out the tool shop. Suddenly, Rudy was impressed by something. A beautiful magic bag caught his eye. He continued walking, saying he would look for something to eat. The next day, inside the dungeon, the monsters were being easily defeated. Rudy never imagined he would be able to defeat them so easily. Just yesterday, he would have been running away. The protagonist used his analysis skill and his eyes began to glow as he saw the rat's stats in detail. Rudy realized that this skill was something he acquired after eating the monster. He continued observing the rats, thinking they were only level 9, which made him wonder how much his own stats had increased. He took out his guild card. Since he defeated the rats so easily, he thought he should be at level 20. When he opened his status window, the protagonist was surprised to see that his current level was. Considering that just yesterday he was at level 1, Rudy commented that this was weird and decided to check his skills. When he opened his status window again, he was happy to see that he had several new skills. He remembered that when passing by the place where he fell into the dungeon, the wall was already sealed. The new dungeon would be sealed for a while, so Rudy confidently decided to explore the miasma. He wanted to test his new skills on deeper floors. Besides, he wanted to try out the new bag he had bought earlier. Rudy went to the stairs and said he wanted to choose the right monster to test his skills on. He started going down, passing the 6th floor, the 9th floor, and the 13th floor. However, he found all of that uninteresting and thought he needed to go deeper. After a while, the protagonist reached the 24th floor, where he encountered a monster with armor and a sword. Rudy hid behind a rock and used his analysis skill, seeing that the monster was only level 25. The protagonist commented that lizard soldiers fight in groups, but there was only one here. He looked at the sword, smiled, and said it might be worth it to try. Rudy attacked, and the lizard noticed his movements, trying to dodge, but the protagonist's attack still grazed it. Rudy smiled and said that wasn't bad, but he wouldn't miss the next one. The lizard fled, leaving the protagonist confused. Rudy chased after it, yelling for it to wait. He was a bit confused because the monster ran into an alley. The protagonist approached, saying that it wouldn't escape now. The lizard turned around, smiling, and stared intently at the protagonist. Rudy sensed other presences behind him, turned around slowly, and found 2 more lizards. Soon, the protagonist realized it was a trap. He kept his eyes on the lizards and prepared for the fight, thinking he was completely surrounded. Even with the level difference, the situation still looked bad. One of the lizards attacked, but Rudy dodged it, thinking that in this case, he would take them down one by one. He moved quickly and attacked one of the lizards, shouting that it was time to have some fun. His strength was great, and he managed to knock down the lizard, which just stared at the next attack. Rudy prepared himself, thinking he would end this now. However, another lizard stepped forward to protect its companion. The protagonist was confused by this behavior. He realized the other one was attacking him from behind and managed to dodge it at the last second. The lizard watched him, as Rudy smiled and said that was close. Several more lizards began to appear, making the protagonist wonder how many were left. Rudy thought, even if they worked well together, how did they manage to set up this ambush and coordinate their attacks so well? Thinking a bit more, he remembered that before they acted, he had heard a high-pitched sound that could only mean one thing. Looking back, the protagonist could see the leader coordinating all the lizard's attacks. He quickly used his analysis, skill, and focused directly on the boss. Its level was higher than the others, and one of its skills was command. Rudy started to laugh, thinking he had finally found the one calling the shots. The boss realized it had been spotted and began to screech. The other lizards also started to screech, and 3 of them attacked at the same time. Rudy used physical reinforcement and gathered his strength to counterattack. He defeated everyone in his path. A lizard stood in front of him, but the protagonist ignored it and simply trampled it. He jumped over all the lizards and headed straight for the leader. The boss just stared as the protagonist charged, thinking he had finally caught it. Rudy landed a direct hit, but was surprised by what happened. The leader didn't have a single scratch. The boss realized the protagonist had let his guard down, grabbed its sword, and charged at him. Rudy thought he wouldn't be able to dodge the attack, but when the boss's strike landed, nothing happened because he had activated his Iron Body skill. The protagonist laughed and told the boss that he wasn't the only one with an ace up his sleeve. The leader backed away, and Rudy took the opportunity to assess the situation, confused by what had happened, since he thought he had hit the boss, but it hadn't caused any damage. After analyzing it, Rudy confirmed that the leader had no resistance skills, so it must have been another lizard. He checked all of them, the others around it, but he couldn't find any special skills. Suddenly, he found it. One of the lizards had a wound, and one of its skills was substitution. Rudy figured it was the lizard that was taking all the damage. The lizard realized it had been spotted, but it was too late. Rudy managed to strike it. The protagonist remarked that it must be tough being a subordinate who only exists to take damage. The lizard began to tremble and fell to the ground. As it hit the floor, Rudy told them not to take it personally. The boss, seeing this, became furious and started to shriek. All the lizards attacked at once, but the protagonist used his web manipulation skill and managed to evade all the attacks. The leader watched in disbelief from above. Rudy said that by grouping up, they had made it easier for him to use his webs, so he created a net and threw it at them. The boss just stared, not reacting at all. All the lizards were defeated, including their leader. The protagonist walked over and said, "Looks like I won," and with one firm strike, he ended the battle. The leader was defeated, and as a result, so were all the others. The protagonist stood among them and said, "Now it's time for a snack." Rudy took out his bag, saying it was time to use the magic pouch. The space inside magically expanded and its weight was completely reduced. He began to rummage through the bag, looking for cooking supplies. Rudy pulled out a pot, a cutting board, and some seasonings. As he prepared the meal, he thought about how he'd been desperate just to survive, but he had always wanted to try something like this. The protagonist began to cook, wondering about the monster meat. After it was ready, he looked at the dish and his mouth started to water, thinking that cooking and eating it would be an amazing experience. With a strong urge to taste it, he took a piece and began to eat. Rudy was shocked by the flavor. It was delicious. He kept eating, not expecting it to be this good. As he ate, the protagonist realized he had acquired new skills and wondered why it tasted so good and if it was because of the magic particles. The Minotaur's skills, the spider armor, and the evil eye had been very useful. However, there were still other skills he hadn't tried, like the lightning wolf skill and the black serpent's poison. Once he finished eating, Rudy got up excitedly, thinking he would eat more on the way back. He glanced to the side and saw the lizard with the substitution skill was still there. Sometime later, on the 21st floor, different kinds of monsters appeared. The protagonist began his attack with the lightning mantle skill, defeating them all at once. The monsters dropped to the floor, and he thought that this skill was great too. Rudy commented that these monsters inflicted status ailments, but they picked the wrong opponent. The protagonist smiled and grabbed his loot, saying that today he'd be having frog meat with bugs. He fried up Sharon. As he ate, he thought the frog meat was as tender as a mushroom. New skills were acquired. Suddenly, he heard a noise. The protagonist wondered what it was, as it sounded like a thud and human voices. He was glad to know there were adventurers who had made it this far. Rudy began to pack up his things and, thanks the monsters for the meal he had. He runs off, thinking that it's hard to see other groups in combat, but maybe he could gather some information. His sword was dirty, and a girl was injured, lying on the ground, in front of several men. She was in pain from her wounds. One of the men says that the attack hurt him because he didn't expect the young woman to have so much magic left. The leader approaches and says the trouble she caused will be worth the price. He stretches and removes his hood, revealing that he's an elf. The girl, frightened, can't say a word. The men start to laugh, wondering how much she's worth. Suddenly, Rudy appears, saying that he was hoping to find some friendly adventurers. The leader and the others look back, surprised. The protagonist walks toward them, saying he doesn't know what's going on, but he can't just stand by while a lady is being attacked. The leader asks who he is. Rudy smiles and says he's just an adventurer, thinking that he has rank. The elf shouts at him to get lost, warning him that these men are adventurer hunters. Rudy thinks he's heard of them before. He knows they are all high level and uses his eye to analyze them. However, he can only see their levels, as their stats are hidden. This happens with everyone. Rudy is surprised. He wonders if they have some kind of camouflage skill or a magic item. The leader orders the others to capture Rudy, and the drunkard lunges at him. Rudy is impressed by the man's speed, but still manages to defend himself. The man says that wasn't bad. Rudy smiles and replies that, actually, the drunkard is the one who's weak. This enrages the man, and he yells that he's not weak. The others watch the fight between the two. When the blonde lowers his guard, Rudy uses his poison skill, hitting the drunkard's face. The man screams in pain. The others look at Zagreus, who is collapsed on the ground, and ask if Rudy spit poison on him. The group looks at Rudy, thinking he's a monster. Rudy reflects that this is a sloppy way to fight and not how an adventurer should act, but it's the only way he knows how to fight. The leader observes the scene and wonders if that's really a poison skill. They can't underestimate him. He orders the other two to advance together. The two attack first, and Rudy manages to dodge the first blow, thinking that if he stops, even for a second, it'll be the end. The long-haired man attacks next, but Rudy dodges him again. Suddenly, he notices a foot coming at him. The leader is in front, ready to attack. With no time to dodge, he activates his iron body skill. The captain throws a kick, sending Rudy crashing into a green slime. The captain thinks that Rudy must be incredibly tough. Rudy starts to get up, and the blonde says he'll finish this. The protagonist gets to his feet and starts running toward the puddle of slime, but the man shouts at him to stop running. Rudy starts to enter the slime, and the leader tells him to stop, explaining that it's a poison swamp and if he goes deeper, he won't make it out alive. Rudy continues to move forward, as the leader says he won't be able to resist it and will soon turn back. The protagonist looks at them and wonders how long they will stay there, because it seems he'll have to fight seriously. He says he's lucky to have fallen into the swamp, because on top of that, from the miasma, the swamp's vapor will lower the stats of all three of them. They start to feel the effects, and the man with the long hair asks how long Rudy plans to stay in the swamp. The masked man replies that they've been 10 minutes and he's not feeling well. Rudy thinks it's time to act. He wanted to weaken them more. But if he waited any longer, it would only cause more suffering for the injured elf. Rudy approaches and says that the effects of the poison in the miasma can be harsh. The two of them ask if he's going to give up after causing so much trouble. Rudy replies that unfortunately, he's immune to abnormal status effects, so he doesn't know what they're feeling. The captain gets angry upon realizing he's been tricked. Filled with rage, he yells at his men to grab the protagonist immediately. The man in the mask looks at Rudy and charges without hesitation, but the protagonist easily blocks the attack. The man is starting to get weaker. Rudy says the poison drains stamina, and the miasma reduces stats. Suddenly, Rudy realizes the other man is attacking from the side. He activates his iron body skill and the attack causes no damage at all. The long-haired man is confused by this. Taking advantage of both of them being close to him, Rudy uses his lightning cloak skill. A powerful electric shock hits them both at once. Both the man in the mask and the long-haired one are injured, but they don't give up and shout curses at Rudy. But Rudy activates his wind skill and several wind blades strike the bandits. The leader watches as everything unfolds, thinking to himself that Rudy has a poisonous iron body, a lightning cloak, and even an air slash. He wonders why a human has so many monstrous skills. Rudy moves forward, saying that it doesn't matter. The two of them engage in an intense battle. The captain thinks to himself that despite being superior in hand-to-hand combat, he's starting to lose the fight, likely due to the miasma. Rudy keeps advancing and attacking. With no other choice, the captain uses his agility boost and says he had to use it against trash like this. He attacks with everything he has. Rudy fixes his gaze on the captain and activates his physical boost, shattering the leader's sword and winning the tough battle. The protagonist says that if it weren't for the abnormal status effects, the captain would have been much stronger than him. After the fight, the two of them start walking. The elf thanks him for saving her and tells him she doesn't know what would have happened if he hadn't shown up. Rudy says he couldn't just leave her in that situation. He thinks to himself that the elf is trying to maintain her composure, but her body is clearly affected by the miasma. He says he did what he could to give her first aid. He starts to think that it's strange to see an elf in such a remote area and wonders why those men were chasing her. Suddenly, they hear a loud noise. A huge monster appears before them. Rudy thinks it must be the leader of the moths and uses his eye to analyze it. He sees that the monster is level 37. Without a second thought, he jumps in to attack, believing the monster couldn't defeat him. However, the monster uses its skill, and there's no time for Rudy to react. The attack is ferocious, splitting the ground and nearly hitting the elf, who barely dodges. Rudy asks her if all right, and the elf says yes. She prepares herself, saying she was caught off guard, but now it will have to pay for it. The moth starts to fly, and Rudy asks if it really thinks flying will save it. He uses his air slash skill, hitting the monster directly. The monster is seriously injured, which makes it even angrier. It uses its paralyzing scales, but Rudy smiles and says that doesn't work on him. However, he realizes that the attack is also heading towards the elf. She focuses and unleashes a powerful gust of wind, leaving the monster nearly defeated. Rudy is impressed, but that's to be expected from an elf. He approaches the monster and finishes it off. The elf looks at him and asks if he's really immune to poison and paralysis. She also says that his skills are similar to those of monsters. Rudy wonders how to explain that, but the elf suddenly starts to feel unwell and falls to her knees. Rudy gets worried and shouts, asking if she was hit by the paralyzing scales. With ragged breaths, the elf says it's something else. He kneels beside her and she says that once they get out of there, she will explain everything. They start moving towards the exit, and, once outside, they sit under a tree. The elf smiles in relief and says she feels much better now that she's out of the labyrinth. Before telling him everything, she decides to introduce herself and says she's a former adventurer named Alicia. Rudy is surprised and exclaims, asking if she is the Alicia from the Emerald Storm. She smiles, saying that he already knows her. She says she's from the most well-known S-rank party, or Trails. Everyone knows the members of that party, but as far as he remembers, the party was. Alicia lowers her head and confirms, saying that 5 years have passed. That day, they were defeated by monsters. They faced a monster deep inside an S-rank dungeon called AB's Dungeon. During that battle, they lost their leader and another member had to retire due to the severity of their injuries. One more was devoured by the labyrinth. The elf says that not even she came out unscathed. She begins to show her scars a little more. Rudy is startled and asks what she's doing. She explains that the mark is a curse that was placed on her that day, the low-level curse. The protagonist is surprised and says he's never heard of it. Alicia says she didn't know anything about it either. She explains that she tried everything, but could only delay the curse's progression. Those hunters found out about the curse and tried to exploit it for profit. Alicia explains that, in any case, her end would come when her level reached 1. Knowing she couldn't stand the thought of giving in to that scum, even Rudy listens intently and suddenly realizes something. He says that maybe he can help her with that. Rudy thinks about his substitution skill, which allows him to swap places with someone and receive all the damage and negative effects. He says he wants to try something. He asks her if she would accept the skill he's about to activate, which confuses the elf. However, she eventually agrees. The two of them stand up and he touches her shoulder, activating his substitution skill. Suddenly, the curse mark begins to travel up Rudy's arm, leaving stunned. Alicia wonders if the curse will really fall upon him. Realizing it will, she screams at him to stop, saying that if he keeps this up, he'll be affected by the curse. With a smile on his face, Rudy says it's okay and asks her to trust him. An aura forms behind the protagonist, taking the shape of a monster. Alicia watches in fear as the curse enters his body. As soon as Rudy absorbs all of the curse, his unique skill, Abnormal Status Nullification, activates. A bright light fills the area and the curse begins to be completely destroyed. Rudy looks at his hand and thinks that it seems to have worked. The elf, still confused, asks what that was, but the protagonist simply tells her to check her guild card. When she looks at it, her status is normal. The curse has really been destroyed. She can't believe the curse has been broken. Rudy says his unique skill is Abnormal Status Nullification. He thought that by taking the curse upon himself, he could destroy it. Alicia asks if he's an idiot, telling him he shouldn't take such risks for a complete stranger. With tears in her eyes, she smiles in relief and thanks him for saving her life. Rudy looks at her and tries to comfort her, saying that he'll always help those in need. Later that day, she was drinking glass after glass, completely happy. Alicia says the protagonist knows how to pick a place, because the food is cheap and the beer is delicious. She thinks that it's even better that they got kicked out. Rudy asks if she'll be okay drinking so much. Alicia shouts and orders another drink. The protagonist reminds her that just a few hours ago she was seriously injured. She smiles and says she's ready for more and that today is great. Alicia cheers and asks him why he isn't drinking. The protagonist asks her what her plans are now. She says she'd like to get to know him a little better, leaving him surprised. Alicia stares at him and asks why he decided to become an adventurer. He tells her that some time ago, the village he lived in was attacked by monsters. Those monsters destroyed everyone he loved, friends, family. They took everything from him. While Rudy was crying over his mother's body, someone arrived. Thanks to an S-rank adventurer who stepped in to protect him from the monsters, everything changed. The protagonist stared at that person, who smiled back at him, showing a confidence he had never seen before. The adventurer began to fight the monsters and, thanks to that, Rudy survived. Those memories would never be forgotten. Since then, Rudy had wanted to become an S-rank adventurer to save others. That was the reason he chose this path. The elf is happy and says that it's a good goal. He asks if she's going to laugh now. Alicia smiles and says that she also dreamed of reaching S-rank. Besides that, she had always been fighting to become stronger before she was cursed. Alicia says that she's sure she still has comrades trapped in the abyss, and because of that, no matter what, she will challenge that monster again. The protagonist is impressed. She says that for now, until they are strong enough to achieve their goals, they could form a party. Rudy gets a little worried about this and tries to say something, but the two idiots from before approach the table with the elves. The blonde guy says that he's been drinking with a beautiful woman. Calling the protagonist a butcher, the rude man gets irritated, thinking these two are the same ones from last time. The two start bothering Alicia, telling her to stop drinking with the protagonist and come with them. Suddenly, the protagonist stands up, grabs one of them by the shoulder and tells him to let her go immediately. The guy gets angry and grabs Rudy, cursing at him. Rudy and the two guys stare each other down. Alicia tells them to stop immediately. The two look at her as the elf says they're in a tavern, so if they want to fight, they can sit at a table with her. Alicia happily raises her glass and says whoever drinks the most wins. She starts to drink her first glass. The crowd cheers, and 2 more glasses are placed on the table. The 2 guys are already a bit drunk, but the bald guy is drinking 2 glasses at once. Time passes and the table begins to fill with empty glasses. The rude men smiling, watching as the crowd continues to cheer loudly. The shouts can be heard from across the street. The bald guy is completely defeated. The blonde idiot can't take it anymore either. And the elf is still going strong, emerging victorious. Everyone cheers and declares Alicia the winner. She turns to the protagonist and shows him that she's okay. He smiles and agrees with her. They move to a corner of the bar. Rudy tells her she did very well, considering she had already been drinking before the competition. Alicia just smiles. She points at him, says that Rudy is her savior, and adds that she wouldn't stoop so low as to just watch while her savior was being ridiculed. Alicia suddenly stops talking and falls onto the chest of the protagonist, Ernest. He looks at her and says he has no choice, activating his substitution skill once again. She sobers up, and he explains that he transferred all her drunkenness to himself. Since it doesn't affect him, Alicia is delighted, saying that first it was the curse, now the drunkenness, and that just makes her want to form a party with him even more. She returns to the bar and says that she'll drink even more. The elf looks at the daily special and says it's a shame she can't try it. The bartender says that apparently, monsters have taken over the Burman fishing grounds. He has already sent a request to the guild, but all the high-level adventurers are away. He asked the two if they would accept the request. After reaching an agreement, they head to the ice fishing area. Alicia is excited to see that the place is truly beautiful. She says that they need to defeat the monsters as quickly as possible so they can try the chef's special dish. Suddenly, the protagonist notices something. Something rises from the water and nearly hits him. Rudy smirks, saying that the monster the owner mentioned has arrived. Alicia notices something that leaves them both in disbelief. Several other monsters begin to surround the boat they're on. A monster begins to surface from under the boat. Rudy uses his eye to analyze the monsters, seeing their levels and skills. They begin to launch their attacks. The protagonist manages to defend himself using his sword. However, the monsters don't stop attacking and more keep coming. Rudy continues defending, thinking that the attacks don't let up for a second. The boat starts to wobble, and he thinks that he won't be able to keep defending himself without something to brace himself on. He throws his sword, jumping into the water, thinking that if that's the case. So the real fight starts now. Alicia stays on the boat, not understanding why her companion suddenly jumped into the water. Rudy is surrounded by the monsters in the water. However, he smiles and challenges the fish to a fight. The monsters begin to attack. Rudy uses his lightning mantle skill, hitting them all at once. The attack is so powerful that its intense glow can be seen from the outside. Several monsters start to rise up, already lifeless, and the protagonist also appears on the surface. Alicia shouts for him, worried, but the protagonist assures her that everything is fine. Surrounded by the bodies of the monsters, he believes there are still some left. He notices that the grenades are stopping their attack and retreating. Rudy wonders if they are being cautious or if they are protecting something. The protagonist says he will take another look below and asks Alicia to do something. Although confused, she listens carefully to the plan. Rudy dives again with a rope tied around him and realizes that the monsters are not attacking or fleeing. This means they are protecting something. He dives a little deeper and is surprised by what he finds at the bottom of the river. There is a giant creature. Rudy uses his eye to analyze it and sees that the monster is level 38. He wonders if it's an anemone or a hermit crab. Suddenly, one of the tentacles starts to make noise and release air. The tentacle detaches from the creature and becomes a new monster. Rudy is surprised to see that this creature is the one generating the grenades. He believes they must defeat it and, since the monster doesn't attack, he decides to go back and prepare, but suddenly he feels something holding him back. The creature grabbed one of his legs and started to pull him down. The Camillas begin to attack and the protagonist realizes they didn't attack before. It's because they wanted to distract him from the tentacles. Rudy grabs one of the tentacles and uses lightning mantle. He asks the monster what it thinks, pointing out that it doesn't matter the size of the body. If it's in contact with him, it will take damage. Looking closer, the protagonist sees that the tentacles are cut. Rudy remembers that this is the autonomy skill. The monster suddenly detached its tentacles to avoid fatal damage. The monster starts to attack the protagonist with everything it has. Rudy becomes desperate because he is running out of air. He starts to pull on the rope, signaling. Outside, Alicia is on alert, and as soon as she sees the signal, she knows that it's the right time. She begins to use her wind magic to push the boat. The rope starts to pull, and at the last second, the protagonist is dragged away by the boat. The creature watches him as Rudy is pulled away. Once they reach the riverbank, she asks if he is okay. Rudy gets up and thanks her for saving him. He explains that there is a boss underwater that continuously produces camellias. Furthermore, it has rapid healing, so they need to go back quickly. Alicia explains that the monsters have a huge advantage underwater and that her magic won't affect them. She asks if he has a plan. Rudy says there is only one way. He lowers his head and thinks that he must make a decision. Since Alicia has already mentioned the curse and even wants to form a team, that's why he needs to reveal his secret before she decides. At the river's edge, he asks her not to tell anyone what he is about to to show her. She's confused. But she just watches. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the river, the creature continues generating more monsters. Suddenly, it notices something coming in its direction. A glow approaches from the distance. It's the protagonist with his ability to swim at high speed. The grenades try to attack him, but he's too fast and defeats them all in seconds. The boss sees this and becomes enraged. It starts attacking with its tentacles, but Rudy dodges them all and continues swimming between them. He heads straight for the boss. A noise is heard and the water turns red. The protagonist manages to land his blow, and now that he's in contact with the boss, he smiles and says it's over. Rudy uses the lightning cloak and strikes the boss with all his might. Both the boss and the grenades are defeated. The protagonist thinks that now the fishing spot will have peace, but the problem is Alicia. He's worried about what she might think after seeing him devour a monster. With the monster situation resolved, he returns to the surface. When he looks toward the shore, he doesn't see anyone. The protagonist smiles and starts to get out of the water, wondering why he thought she would wait for him. It seems he just got his hopes up once again. Suddenly, he hears a voice telling him that he's taking too long. This paralyzes Rudy. Alicia is carrying some branches as she asks if the protagonist is okay and if he defeated the boss. Rudy says he managed to defeat the boss. She smiles and says she couldn't just wait around, so she decided to gather some firewood to make a campfire and dry the protagonist's clothes. This leaves him speechless. Still confused, Rudy asks her if everything is okay, even after Alicia saw him do that. She starts to light the fire and says she was a little surprised, but smiles and adds that he trusted her enough to reveal the biggest secret he could have, and that made her happier than anything else. Rudy is surprised by these words, but soon starts to feel better and thanks her for it. The protagonist says there's one more thing. He starts pulling on a rope, explaining that he also wanted to get the boss's abilities, so he cut off a part and brought it with him. As he continues to pull, he comments that it would have been strange if he were the only one eating. Alicia comes closer and asks if he really got something. He shows her a fish and says he managed to catch a Barnabas, but that it might be a little strange to eat it near a monster. Before he finishes speaking, Alicia excitedly interrupts him, shouting that she's going to eat it. Rudy smiles and starts to laugh as the sun begins to set. He comments that while they eat, he'll tell her the story of the first time he ate a monster. They place the food and clothes near the fire. Alicia tries the fish and is happy. She says it tastes delicious, but she's still a little surprised that the protagonist eats monsters. Rudy explains that this was how a guy of E rank managed to get closer to his dream. Alicia comments that he used this power to save her from the adventurer hunters and the curse. Watching him eat, she says that when monsters are cooked this way, they actually look tasty. The protagonist had made grenades, steaks, and miso stir-fried tentacles. He's happy with the comment and says that monsters are surprisingly tasty. Rudy admits he no longer needs to eat grenades, but emphasizes that they must be cooked the right way. He asks Alicia if she wants to try some, but she replies that she doesn't know if she would survive the side effects. However, once she finishes eating, she declares that she'll have more with a smile. Alicia asks if the protagonist wants to join her party. He stays silent for a moment, then asks if she doesn't know someone stronger for that. Alicia looks down and explains that it's already been 5 years since she was marked and that, considering the human life expectancy, those who are still alive have probably retired. She points out that most of the frontline adventurers are crazy and that she can't trust them. Holding out her hand, she says she wants someone to accompany her on her adventures, someone she can trust 100%. If that person is him, then she's willing to try again. This deeply moves Rudy. He closes his eyes, smiles, and accepts the request, saying that they are now a pair. The next day, at the Adventurers Guild, Alicia is excited and shouts that they must prepare for their party's first job. Rudy comments that he doesn't think they'll get a good mission because of his rank. She agrees, but says it's only their first time. They arrive at the reception desk and call for a clerk. Alicia announces that they are forming a party and asks to register it. Upon seeing the card, the young woman gasps upon realizing that Alicia is an S-rank adventurer and asks if she is Alicia of the Emerald Storm. The attendant continues to examine the card, scrutinizing every detail, including the unique skill and other abilities. Then she asks why someone like Alicia is with the Miasma Butcher. Alicia gets irritated and asks what the clerk just said. The young woman quickly apologizes, saying it was nothing. Ignoring the provocation, Alicia asks for the party to be registered and inquires about the requirement to raise the protagonist's rank. The attendant checks the records and informs them that he has already achieved enough accomplishments, but still needs to complete combat missions. Determined, Alicia asks for the toughest subjugation mission available. Once they take the mission, they head to the outskirts of Bellona to face a pack of wolves. The wolves are around level 11 and their main skill is enemy detection. Rudy smiles and uses his stealth skill, approaching the wolves from behind. When the wolves finally notice him, it's already too late. He attacks quickly and takes down several of them. One of the wolves howls, calling for reinforcements, and Rudy tells Alicia that she can handle the newcomers. She wastes no time and summons her spirits. Sophia asks her to lend her its powers. Rudy is impressed as he observes his partner's unique skill. Sophia begins to use its powers, enveloping Alicia in a strong aura, leaving Rudy even more surprised. The wolves continue to attack, but Alicia counterattacks with cyclone eggs. A powerful gust of wind is unleashed that instantly defeats the wolves. All the wolves in front of her are eliminated with no chance to fight back. The protagonist is shocked by the enormous amount of power. He observes the devastation on the ground and the bodies of the wolves, thinking that it's an absurd force, something impossible to dodge. Alicia smiles and comments that her power. This is her before the curse is even lifted, and she's still not back to normal. Rudy begins to imagine what this woman would be like at her full strength. Suddenly, a noise catches his attention. More wolves have arrived and one of them is already charging to attack him. Surprised, he realizes he didn't expect there to be so many hidden wolves. The wolf is very close and Rudy wouldn't be able to block the attack in time. Alicia shouts for the seals to be fed and a strong light appears. The attacking wolf suddenly stops and everyone is confused. As Alicia and Rudy disappear, a noise coming from above catches their attention. When they look up, they see both of them flying. Surprised, Rudy comments that this is incredible and that he didn't expect Alicia could do something like this. He thanks her for saving his life, but she says that if he wants to thank someone, he should thank the little seal she feeds. Looking down, Alicia warns that it's not time to let their guard down yet, mentioning that she saw 5 more wolves in the bushes and that there are probably many more hidden. Rudy says it's his turn to act, leaving Alicia confused, and activates his echolocation ability and identifies all the hidden wolves, warning her that there are around 30. He starts to laugh, thinking that with those, added to the ones they've already faced, they'll be able to complete the mission in one go. He asks Alicia to attack the spots he points out. The hidden wolves begin to notice a strong light and start to panic. A powerful attack hits the hiding spot of some of the wolves, while others try to escape. Alicia continues to bombard from above, taking down several of them. Rudy realizes that his echolocation loses precision in open areas and that Alicia can't target multiple objectives at the same time. However, he concludes that if they attack in a circle, they can concentrate the wolves in a single spot. Alicia takes a deep breath and says that her part is done and the rest is up to him. The wolves, now gathered and scared, become easy prey. Rudy calmly approaches and activates, paralyzing breath, covering the area with a thick fog. One by one, the wolves fall immobilized. Observing the scene, Rudy thinks it's time to finish the mission. By the end of the afternoon, they count 52 defeated wolves. Surprised, Alicia says she can't believe they found so many. Rudy reflects that maybe the wolf population has grown significantly recently. Curious, he asks about the spirit magic Alicia used earlier. She points to Sylvia and explains that she can use the magic of the spirits present in nature. She says that spirits are everywhere, even if they aren't visible, but to be able to use their powers, she must offer her own magic as compensation. This way, she can cast powerful spells while consuming little MP. Additionally, Sylvia has the ability to levitate people. Then, the wind spirit flies towards Rudy's head and starts pulling his hair, while he complains that he had never heard of such strong wind magic. The little spirit continues to pull harder, ignoring his complaints, while Alicia laughs, saying that Sylvia loves to cause trouble and that the more he complains, the more she'll enjoy it. Alicia warns that night is approaching and they must return. Sylvia begins to levitate the protagonist again. Alicia mentions they'll fly part of the way back as the sun sets on the horizon. Rudy flies beside Alicia. Marveling at the experience, he takes the chance to ask her about the other types of magic she commands. Alicia explains that she specializes in water, ice, light, and earth magic, but doesn't have good compatibility with the spirits of darkness and fire. She explains that when a spirit has low compatibility with the user, the magic either consumes a lot of energy or the spirit might refuse to help. Sophie stares intently at Rudy, and Alicia comments that it means she likes him. However, the little spirit starts pulling on the protagonist's ear, which makes him complain and ask if that's how it shows affection. Laughing, Alicia confirms that it is. Suddenly, Rudy notices something strange up ahead. A pillar of smoke is rising into the sky. He shouts to warn Alicia and remarks that there must be a village in that direction. As they get closer, they see a monster rampaging through the village, destroying everything in its path. People are running in a panic as flames spread, and the monster continues its relentless march. Suddenly, the monster stops when it comes across two people. One of them, kneeling, mutters that the wolves weren't the only monsters in the region and wonders why a Baphomet would be there. The monster then creates a magic circle, leaving the warriors terrified. Something begins to emerge from within the magic circle, taking the form of a spear. The Baphomet fires it at high speed toward the two men, but suddenly, a blast of water slams into the spear, saving them. The man is Rudy, who used his water bullet skill. At his side is a small water spirit. The monster glares at him, but Alicia takes advantage of the distraction and appears behind the men, asking if they're all right. She explains that she and the protagonist will take care of the monster and asks them to fill her in on what happened. While Alicia is talking with the two men, the protagonist steps forward and uses his AI to analyze the enemy. The system reveals that the Baphomet is level 27. Rudy reflects that even though the monster's level is lower than the general lizard he faced before, its stats are on a whole other level, which indicates that this is no ordinary monster. More magic circles begin to form around the Baphomet. The protagonist watches intently, recognizing it as an advanced skill related to the principles of magic. The monster begins its attack, forcing Rudy to dodge. He thinks to himself that his magic is too weak to be used in battle, but he continues to press forward. The monster, surprised by his boldness, watches as the protagonist closes in. Rudy leaps into attack, thinking that if he could just devour this monster, it would be perfect, since he could use its magic in the next battle. He tries to strike, but the monster blocks the blow with its hand. Surprised, Rudy notes its resistance and wonders if that skill is Iron Claw. If so, he'll have to resort to brute force to beat it. Taking advantage of the close range, the Baphomet launches 4 more attacks. An explosion rocks the area, and the elf is startled by the impact. However, the protagonist appears unharmed, and Alicia rushes over to him and asks if he's okay. He confirms that he is, and as he analyzes the monster, he realizes that the Baphomet used 2 attacks for offense and kept 2 for defense, making it an opponent that was strategically difficult. Alicia informs him that the monster has raised its guard and they need to exchange information while they can, pointing out that the villagers haven't fully evacuated yet. She had already requested help for the evacuation and emphasizes that minimizing collateral damage is the priority, limiting their most powerful magic while facing Baphomet. Rudy deduces that Alicia must be low on mana from the previous battle. He decides that it's his responsibility to handle the situation. Suddenly, Alicia asks to be allowed to use her magic, surprising Rudy. However, she shows confidence and asks him to trust her. Determined, Rudy charges forward at full speed, ignoring the monster's attacks and focusing on his own assault. Meanwhile, Alicia begins to cast water magic. Her shots collide with the monster's attacks, protecting the protagonist. Rudy is impressed by Alicia's ability to cancel Baphomet's magic with an opposing spell of equal power. Realizing the threat, the monster starts using another spell, causing several rocks to levitate and hurling them at the two of them. Alicia, however, remains composed and uses her magic to make the rocks crash into each other. Rudy realizes that she's conserving mana, preventing collateral damage with incredible magical control. He smiles, recognizing this is what's expected of a donkey. With Alicia's protection, Rudy finally reaches the monster and leaps to attack it. Now, using physical reinforcement, he easily breaks through Baphomet's defense this time, landing a devastating blow. The monster, filled with rage, tries to attack Rudy with its other hand, but the protagonist stands still, fully trusting his partner. Seconds later, a fire attack strikes Baphomet directly. The monster screams in pain as Alicia, from a distance, controls the flames, consuming it. She smiles and taunts Baphomet, asking how it feels to get a taste of its own power. The monster burns until it finally stops moving. With the danger averted, the villagers watch the scene, terrified by the scream of the monster. A young man, still shaken, wonders if the explosion and the scream mean the two adventurers have won. An injured man regrets not being able to help in the battle. Suddenly, Alicia appears, thanking the young man for helping with the evacuation. She asks if he's okay, to which the elf smiles and says yes, thus confirming that Baphomet has been defeated. However, she warns that even though she landed a fatal blow, if the monster somehow survives, it could attack again. They need to locate Baphomet to finish the battle, and for that, she wants to ask for help from the villagers. The young man shouts that if the monster is within their reach, they'll do everything they can to help her. She starts to laugh, and the young man looks a little confused. Alicia says that if they have any food to share, she would appreciate it because she's starving. Later, in the forest surrounding the village, the protagonist is preparing Baphomet's meat. Alicia arrives happily, saying she's back. He greets her and asks how the villagers are doing. She says everyone managed to escape safe and sound thanks to the two adventurers who helped with the evacuation. Alicia sits next to the protagonist and says she explained to everyone that they were going after the Baphomet so no one would suspect the body had disappeared. Rudy apologizes for making her lie and thanks her for her help. He starts to salivate and says it looks delicious. The Baphomet soup is ready. Rudy finishes it off with a bit of mugwort and ginger while Alicia watches. He tries it, smiles, and says it's delicious. Although it has a strong goat-like flavor, the little elf's mouth waters watching him eat. As he eats, new skills are acquired. Alicia watches the protagonist eat and comments that it looks delicious. However, seeing someone eat a humanoid monster is a bit strange. The protagonist stops eating and thinks she's right. What's even more strange is that he's already gotten used to eating it. As they are sitting by the fire, another monster appears near them. 3 level 22 stomper monsters stare at them. The elf yells that the monsters are here and the protagonist says there are many monsters in this area. Rudy stands up and says that if it's come to this, it means it's time to test his new magic. Everything goes silent and nothing happens. Rudy asks what's going on. The stomper monsters begin to attack. The protagonist is taken by surprise and the boar rushes quickly past them, hitting the camp and causing a small explosion. The Baphomet soup is thrown to the ground. Alicia yells and says she thought the protagonist was going to use magic now. Rudy starts to get up irritated and says he's low on mana, so he won't be able to help much. But this is unforgivable. The elf is confused by this. The protagonist looks at the food on the ground and says he removed all the impurities from the monster to prepare the dish, and it took him a long time. He says he was really looking forward to tasting that meat, which is why he used the best seasoning. Those pigs would be responsible for it. Fury takes over the protagonist, his eyes glow, and he yells that he's going to eat those damn creatures now. Alicia gets scared by this and shakes him, yelling at him to calm down. She explains that the skill he just used is called Quick Step. This increases his acceleration force, making all his attacks powerful. This means that, even if it's not favorable, they need to fight from a distance to avoid the range of Quick Step. The pigs continue to stare at them, and she says that, to sum it up, they need to retreat now. The two of them run and the boars chase them. The night passes and the boars are still looking for them. Both are perched in a tree. The elf thinks that, by the looks of it, they managed to get away from the pigs. She starts to whisper to him about the magic he couldn't use. Rudy explains that he's never had trouble using the skills he's acquired until now. Alicia tells him to analyze it with his analyzer eye. The protagonist agrees, realizing that she's right. He starts to use the eye. He gets confused because it says he should understand it instinctively. The elf thinks for a moment and says that if he still can't use it, it must be one thing. She pauses and says that he's so stupid and has such a limited brain that's why he couldn't understand the magic. Rudy comments that this was a bit rude. She keeps thinking and says that the protagonist can use fire magic, even if it's weak, so that's not a good explanation for why he couldn't use the other skills. Suddenly, the elf has an idea. She says that maybe to be able to use magic or monster skills he needs to learn to manipulate mana. Rudy says he understands now. It's not enough to have the magic, he needs to manipulate mana. Alicia says she doesn't know much about mana, but it might be similar to absorbing monster skills. The protagonist says he'll try. He starts to concentrate and remembers the time he ate the Minotaur, his arm and his wounds were healed immediately. Shortly after, an explosion of power begins to radiate from his body. Rudy thinks that if he can manipulate that power outside of his body, he feels the strength increasing in his arm. The elf is surprised by what she sees. The protagonist slowly opens his eyes and is also surprised by what he sees. He had created some magic circles in front of him. Rudy is happy, thinking he did it. He fires the attacks, thinking that, as long as he can feel the mana, he can use it as if it were part of his body. The stamper looks up and sees the attacks coming. The explosion is so strong that it's huge. The 3 boars don't survive the impact. Without wasting time, Rudy runs and starts to fry the boar meat, excitedly saying that stamper ribs would be the perfect dish. He turns to Alicia and apologizes for making her wait so long, but she tells him it's fine, that it's something he has to do. Alicia starts to explain that Rudy needs to use mana, not magic, to activate his skills. Based on his last attack, the protagonist wasn't exhausted. It seems Rudy will be able to use this skill all the time. He agrees and says that as soon as he felt the mana spreading through his body, he understood immediately how to use it. And if mana can replace magical power, maybe Rudy can use it to strengthen his body and his weapons. Among adventurers, many decide to polish their magical skills and most use them in melee combat, circulating magical power throughout the body. Their abilities improve, and if it's used on a weapon, the attack power increases. It's even possible to launch magical slashes. The elf says she understands now, pointing out that the protagonist didn't have much magic before, which is why he couldn't use his skills. He finishes preparing his dish and says that he now has much more mana than before, but most importantly, he can apparently replenish his mana by eating more monsters. He eats a piece of the stamper and absorbs the quick step skill. Alicia watches him thinking that Rudy can absorb mana through food and even store it in his body. She looks at her food, drooling, thinking that those pork ribs look delicious. The protagonist sees her drooling and asks if she's craving some. The elf hesitates, trying to hide it. Suddenly, they hear another noise and something is coming towards them. They both look to the side and another monster appears. Before them stands a large stamper. Rudy says the boss has finally arrived. The boar charges to attack Alicia. She freezes because the boss is too fast and she won't be able to escape. Rudy sees this and uses his quick step skill to save her from the attack. The elf thanks him once again for saving her life. She watches the boss, thinking that the moment she sensed something from a distance, it was already right in front of her. She's confused, since they aren't in a dungeon. A monster like that shouldn't be here. Suddenly, the protagonist gets angry again and says it's always the same nonsense. The food he prepared was ruined once more. He yells at the boss and tells it to stop interrupting, asking if that boss would make a good roast, but he quickly thinks better of it, since it's fire-resistant. However, if they air-fried it, it would taste good. That is, the Stamping King, level 38. Rudy also thinks its stats are pretty solid. He crouches down and begins to use earth magic. The boss only has quick step and fire resistance. A hand begins to rise from the ground and the protagonist tells the boss to prepare to feel the wrath of a glutton. However, the king easily breaks the attack, leaving Rudy stunned, thinking it was ironclad. The monster throws a direct punch at the protagonist, sending him flying. Rudy crashes into a tree and falls unconscious. Alicia is worried about him, but there's no time, as the boss is coming for her. She summons Sophia and uses her wind attacks to hurt the boss. The elf starts to catch her breath, thinking she's hit the boss, but the boss doesn't use magic, since its muscles and fur are as thick as armor. She can't win against that. The king is now face with her. Alicia is worried, thinking here it comes. The boss begins to charge for another attack. Suddenly, an enormous pressure is felt and a fierce roar echoes through the forest, making the boss stop in its tracks. Rudy is angry. He gets to his feet and tells the pig not to dare ignore him, as they aren't finished yet. Rudy thinks he can't use quick step or iron body right now, and if this turns into a battle of attrition, there's a chance the damn pig will target the elf. The protagonist analyzes the situation, but he realizes he doesn't have the ability to defeat the boss in a single move, even though the pig only charges in a straight line. With no other options, he closes his eyes, thinking it's the first time he's using this. He raises his sword, thinking he needs to try it. The boss charges quickly towards him. Alicia screams as she witnesses the scene before her eyes. Rudy thinks that first he needs to gather the mana from within his body, then he needs to imagine it flowing into the sword. The boss glares at the protagonist and attacks. At the last second, Rudy opens his eyes, and with a single strike, he ends the battle. Alicia is stunned. The boss has been defeated. However, even the protagonist himself is confused by his own power. He looks around and says he did it. The elf is in shock, saying that the protagonist used mana to strengthen his sword, even without any practice. Rudy smiles and says he tried it because he felt it was possible, since his mana was overflowing. Suddenly, his sword cracks and shatters in front of them. Alicia looks at the sword, not expecting that. On the other hand, the protagonist despairs and starts screaming for his sword. Heartbroken, Rudy says he's used it a lot, so there's nothing to be done. The elf says that the sword couldn't handle the mana. Besides, she understands how he feels, since a weapon is an extension of the body. The protagonist says they should call it a day and points out that he'll get some meat from the boss. Meanwhile, in the dungeon of Miasma from the 7th floor, the guy from before is in battle, using his firepower to attack a large, level 17 rat. His companions were also helping him fight the rats. The one in the black cloak attacks a rat, finishes it off easily. After a long battle, they finish clearing the area. The young man says that this is a superior species of miasma rats. The large rat is a tough opponent. His companions smile and say that they were still no match for their great teamwork. They start to laugh. However, the one in the black cloak looks back and the leader asks what happened. The young man starts to walk, saying it's nothing serious, just that he thought he heard voices. Suddenly, they find a staircase and, thinking it's a secret passage, decide to take a look as they go down the stairs. The three of them are impressed, as if a glowing chest is before them. The young man looks closely and says it doesn't look like a trap, while his companion suggests it could be a treasure. They find a sword in the chest. The boy says he can feel magic emanating from it. The three of them are happy, they think it's strong, so they'll be able to sell it for a good price. Riget asks if they're sure it's not cursed. However, the leader tells him not to be so pessimistic. He explains that since they didn't find the protagonist there, they're struggling to make easy money. This means this is a blessing sent to them. Riget agrees with that. The guy in the cloak, Black, smiles and says they're staying out pretty late. It's a good thing the sword is a blessing. Riget says he heard that Rudy has been going out with a beautiful elf lately. The two of them laugh and say he's getting too proud of himself, and that they'll teach him a good lesson, so he learns his place. They start to leave the room, but Rig stays behind, staring intently at the chest. He starts to stare at the open chest, and as Riget looked at the chest, the sword tried to influence its wielder to finish everyone off. The next day, in the border town of Bologna, the protagonist and the elf were walking through the streets, and he says he was thinking of asking for advice from a weapon seller he knows. They head to a place called Miner's Hammer Weapon Shop. The shop owner, named Doom, begins to inspect the protagonist's sword. He says that for a sword that he personally forged, it must have taken a lot to break it that way. Only brute force could have caused that kind of damage. Doom asks the protagonist what he imbued into the sword. Alicia whispers, asking if he's going to tell him. Rudy says yes and explains that he will tell him everything, as he has known Old Man Doom for a long time and trusts him completely. After hearing the story, Doom is intrigued to learn that if the protagonist eats monsters, he gains their abilities. He notes that's why Rudy's power has skyrocketed. The elf girl comments that Doom doesn't seem that surprised. The old man says that as long as it tastes good, it doesn't matter what you eat. Doom then adds that the most important thing is that the protagonist wants a sword that can withstand a good amount of mana. He stresses that, taking into account the research time, it will take a while to forge one. Rudy asks if there's anything he can do to help. The old man replies that it would be good to have some high-quality magic stones. The protagonist, he says he has some materials with him. As soon as he throws the stones on the table, Doom is impressed, thinking that among them are the stone of the General Lizard, Baphomet, and even one from a Minotaur. He comments that it seems Rudy's skills have improved quite a bit. The protagonist, embarrassed, says that it feels good to be praised by Old Man Doom, saying that if anything else is needed, he'll let him know while he prepares a new sword. The old man gives one to the protagonist to use, although Doom warns him that under no circumstances should he imbue that sword with mana, because if he breaks it, the old man will demand an absurd compensation. The protagonist and Alicia are scared, but they agree. Once they leave the shop, they head straight for the tavern. The elf girl suggests they avoid magic attacks for a while. Rudy comments that the old man gets terrifying when it comes to his weapons. Alicia smiles and says that, although Doom is intense, she's happy to have met one of his friends. The protagonist feels embarrassed and apologizes for being a loner. She starts to laugh and then the guy from before walks in, saying it looks like they're having fun. He asks if he and his friends can join them, calling the protagonist the Miasma Butcher. Rudy gets angry and says it's happening again. The elf girl looks at them and asks if they have a problem with them, because if so, they could settle it by drinking like good adventurers. Rondo starts to tremble with rage and suddenly loses his balance and falls under the nearby table. The leader looks worried and asks if he had been drinking alone or something. However, he sees that Rondo hasn't sold the sword he found in the dungeon. The sword begins to release an ominous aura, urging Rondo to attack everyone there. He tries to resist, but the influence of the sword is driving him crazy. Rondo tries to stop it, but he is overcome by the sword's fury and yells at his leader to shut up. He charges forward, screaming, and attacks his companion. Rigert is confused when he sees Magnus get hit by the attack. Still full of rage, Rondo turns and aims his attack at the elf girl. Rudy steps forward and defends against the blow, saying that this won't be solved with just a drink. Magnus starts to fall after being wounded. Rigert is still worried and doesn't know what to do. The protagonist keeps watching Rondo, wondering what's wrong with that guy. Other adventurers get angry and ask what Rondo is doing in the middle of their celebration. One of the men tries to restrain him, but the sword keeps releasing more power. With a single blow, Rondo manages to defeat the adventurers. Alicia apologizes to the innkeeper for what she's about to do, but she has to destroy everything. She casts her magic and fires at Rondo, hitting him and throwing him far away, destroying the whole place. They move towards the hole in the wall and wonder what the hell is going on with that guy. Alicia is surprised by what she sees. Rondo gets up and says that he will defeat everyone there. Rudy asks her if she held back her attack power. The elf girl says that a mediocre adventurer shouldn't be able to get up after taking a direct hit like that. Rondo begins to make strange noises and attacks again, shouting that he will finish everyone off. The protagonist runs towards him, yelling at him that that's wrong. Alicia tells one of the adventurers there to take care of the injured. The two of them once again clash with their attacks. Rudy takes the opportunity to analyze Rondo's status, which shows that he is at level 22, but his status is madness. The protagonist continues to simply defend against Rondo's attacks, thinking that the young man has entered berserker mode. The sword keeps releasing more power, and Rudy notices that compared to the usual Rondo, his state is incredibly superior. Alicia yells for the protagonist to get out of the way. He looks at her, who already has her magi ready, saying that this time she will attack with her full strength. Rudy jumps to the side, while the elf girl fires her attack. However, the sword faces it and begins to absorb all that energy. Alicia can't believe the sword actually absorbed all that damage. She notices that the sword is emitting even more energy, completely enveloping the boy's body. Alicia yells at the protagonist to be careful because that is a sword. Rudy looks at Rondo and asks if he's getting stronger by absorbing that magic. The boy is already surrounded by several things around his body. He can no longer speak and only attacks. The protagonist defends against the blow, but notices that Rondo's strength is increasing with each moment. He keeps defending against the attacks, but the boy doesn't stop attacking for even a second. Rudy also starts to attack, aiming for non-lethal points and manages to hit one of Rondo's legs. However, he is surprised to see that the tentacles close the wound. Alicia watches worriedly because she can't support the protagonist, as the sword could absorb her magic and become even stronger. However, she doesn't want to just stand by and watch, thinking that if she really wants to help her companion, she needs to find an opportunity and land a decisive blow. Suddenly, Rigard appears, begging them not to finish off Rondo. He keeps shouting, telling the protagonist that he knows they have made many mistakes against him, but that for a failure like him, even though he lived being despised and despising others, his companions have become his family. With tears in his eyes, he pleads for his friend's life. Rudy steps forward and says he will do the best he can. Rondo keeps screaming and attacking. The protagonist states that he will try the substitution and warns that no one can interfere. The elf girl smiles and says she understands. He dodges an attack, thinking that when he used this technique with Alicia, it took about 10 seconds. Rondo keeps attacking non-stop, while the protagonist dodges everything, thinking that the problem is keeping this guy under control for those decades, while trying to get rid of the curse. The protagonist takes a hit that pushes him aside. Alicia shouts worriedly, but he had blocked it with his sword, saying that the blows were very strong. He clings to the arm holding the sword, thinking that if he can just immobilize it, he'll be able to resist. Rondo tries to shake the protagonist off, but Rudy starts using his skill, and the boy can't free his arm. Rudy uses earth magic to restrain Rondo, since he won't be able to absorb this magic. The boy is completely immobilized. Rudy lets go of Rondo's arm and approaches, thinking that if the cause of his madness is the curse, he can free him just as he did with Alicia. This way, he can return him to normal. Rudy activates the substitution and hits Rondo's chest. A dense aura begins to emanate, but the protagonist doesn't back down and continues to use his ability. Little by little, Rondo starts to return to normal. Magnus and Rigat see this. Rondo begins to cry out for help. The protagonist remains determined to eliminate the boy's curse, but the curse begins to fight back. Suddenly, Rudy is thrown far away. Alicia shouts in worry and the protagonist says he's fine. However, the substitution failed. Rondo is once again dominated by the curse and the prison Rudy had created begins to crack. The protagonist thinks that it wasn't Rondo who rejected the substitution. It was almost as if the sword had a will of its own. So, if he can weaken the sword a little more, maybe he can stop the curse. He starts shooting, his shots attacking Rondo. Before the attack can land, the boy breaks free. The protagonist worries as he realizes he only managed to remove the curse from Rondo's left arm. But now, as it is, he can only attack from outside the reach of Rondo's right arm. Rondo's body is almost completely covered by the tentacles. Rudy notices that Rondo is making strange movements. He managed to move and the attack went straight to the sword, which absorbed the magic completely. The sword reached a very high level of mana and released all the energy into Rondo's body, causing him to scream in pain. A gigantic pressure, with a dense aura, began to be released on a large scale. He saw this, thinking it was the incarnation. Rondo's arms and legs began to take on a different form, which meant his body no longer belonged to him. Rudy used his analysis ability. The system showed that what was in front of him was the two-headed curse named Graham, a race with the incarnation condition. In a matter of seconds, the curse attacked the protagonist, but he managed to dodge the attack. Rudy continued to fight fiercely against the creature, but Graham's attacks were incredibly strong. The protagonist took a hit and thought Graham was too fast, but upon analyzing it more thoroughly, Rudy realized that the curse simply wasn't making any unnecessary movements, just like an experienced warrior. Suddenly, Graham appeared behind the protagonist, who turned to look at him, seeing the attack coming. The elf girl, seeing her partner in danger, decided to act, circulating magic through her body. She charged and gave Graham a flying kick, but it used its tail to hold its ground. Alicia took advantage of the short distance and fired a powerful attack at the monster, sending it flying. Graham crashed into a wall, causing a loud noise. Alicia said that, apparently, she would have to interfere a little in the fight. Rudy thanked her, noting that he didn't know she fought well at close range. Alicia replied that a mage who becomes useless when the enemy gets too close is a burden to their comrades. She placed her hand on the arm that had been injured and said this wasn't an opponent they could take lightly, emphasizing that Rudy needed to make a decision because the curse had already progressed too far. Graham got up again, and the elf girl said that if they didn't fight to end this, they wouldn't be able to stop it. The protagonist hesitated to make this decision, but then he braced himself and said that the healer understood, asking Magnus to stay still, but he started to get up and called out to Rigget, asking if he had heard what Alicia said before. Meanwhile, the two of them were fighting the curse, but even with two people, they couldn't find an opening. The protagonist thought that maybe two heads would widen Graham's field of vision. He yelled at the elf girl to back off for a while, and although confused, she listened to her companion and moved away. Rudy slammed his hand on the ground and created several magic circles that raised a wall. Alicia saw this and thought she understood, because if they only used magic to raise the wall, Graham wouldn't be able to absorb it. In the middle of the wall, a person's shadow appeared, and the curse noticed this, turning around and attacking the shadow with everything it had, but it was just a clay doll created as a distraction. The real Rudy was behind it. Without hesitation, the protagonist landed a powerful blow that directly hit Graham. This created an opening for Alicia, who was already in front of him, ready to attack. She began to cast her magic, invoking the magic of the Earth Spirit attribute. The Earth Spirit appeared. Its name was Naomi. Alicia used Naomi as her power and struck the curse with a powerful earth attack. However, she grew worried because the shot didn't finish off the curse. Graham quickly attacked her. Suddenly, Richard grabbed the curse's arm, stopping the attack. Rudy was shocked to see them both fighting, crying out for his friend. Richard shouted that he would stop Graham, even if it cost him his life. Magnus also charged forward to attack, yelling that it would be the three of them together. He landed a decisive blow to the curse's heart. Graham began to scream in pain while Magnus held firm, though tears streamed down his face. The three of them fell to the ground together. The curse was defeated. The price was the life of their companion, friend, and brother. Rudy and Alicia remained silent, simply watching the scene. Although neither of them could express the pain of losing a friend, Rudy noticed that next to them, the sword was on the ground. He walked over to it and picked it up. Rudy thinks that even if he hides the sword somewhere, he can't know when the next victim will appear. Suddenly, the sword begins to speak to him, ordering him to destroy everything and everyone. Rudy stares at it and uses his unique skill. The system notifies him that the curse has been nullified. The protagonist tells the sword to shut up, saying that he's empty and words don't work on him. Suddenly, Lancaster opens the guild door, asking if everyone is okay. Rondo lies on the ground as his body disappears. Rudy holds the sword and says it's over. Lancaster asks them to meet at the guild so he can clarify what happened. After the explanation, Lancaster says it seems Rondo increased his strength thanks to the sword's curse. With Magnus's testimony, all the other adventurers will discuss what happened. The guildmaster notices that the protagonist is holding the sword and asks if he feels anything while holding it. Rudy replies that thanks to his unique ability to nullify abnormal statuses, no curse has any effect on him. As long as he is the wielder of the sword, there will be no more victims. Lancaster says he understands, but adds that if the day comes when the protagonist is hit by the curse of the sword, Rudy interrupts him and says that when that time comes, the guildmaster must do what is necessary. The elf girl seems a little distressed by this. Lancaster thanks the protagonist and Alicia for containing the incident. As for Magnus, the master says he would like to offer his condolences. However, no one there will have time to rest. The elf girl asks if something happened. The guildmaster explains that all the adventurers who were there with him were called for this exact reason. He explains that recently the number of monsters outside the dungeons has been increasing at an abnormal rate. It seems these new monsters are coming from a newly discovered dungeon in Abellio. According to the investigation, the cause of this is a certain monster. Rudy asks what monster this is. Lancaster says that it is the Miasma Dragon Basilisk. He notes that he has only seen this monster in books, but its estimated level is around 70. The protagonist is impressed. The guildmaster says the problem isn't the level, but the concentration of miasma. He says its miasma stimulates other monsters, causing them to leave the dungeon. This is what happened to the investigation team, and those who managed to return are being treated right now. Lancaster says that if this continues, it won't stop with just the monsters, as the miasma will leak from the dungeon. The damage to the nearby areas would be immeasurable, and that's why he called them there. Rudy says that he understands the situation and asks to be taken immediately to the investigation team that returned. They go to the infirmary. The protagonist approaches one of the injured, who is in intense pain. With a gentle touch, Rudy begins to use his substitution skill. Lancaster observes this and says it's incredible. The elf girl simply smiles from a distance. The adventurer, who was previously screaming in pain, can now sleep peacefully. The guildmaster says this is surprising, because he didn't know the protagonist could nullify other people's status effects. Rudy explains that he can only do this if the person he touches doesn't reject it, and that's why the only ones who will participate in the dragon hunt will be him and Alicia. One of the adventurers says this is insane. Lancaster looks intently at the protagonist and asks what their chances of winning are. Rudy explains that the fewer people he has to protect from the miasma, the easier it will be for him to move. Besides, he's already used to fighting alone against powerful opponents. The adventurer says the protagonist sounded very impressive just now, but it's still risky. The guildmaster sighs and pats the protagonist on the shoulder, saying he understands and accepts. He entrusts the protagonist with the mission to subdue the miasma dragon basilisk. It is now nighttime, and once everything is settled, the protagonist and the elf girl start to leave. He says they need to rest well to be prepared for the next day. She asks if everything will be okay, even if it's just the two of them. Rudy smiles and says he can only use his full abilities if no one else is around. He lowers his head and asks Alicia for forgiveness for dragging her into this mess. She asks what he's talking about and tells him that if he had said that he was leaving without her, she would have beaten him up right then and there. Rudy says they're a team and that just the two of them will be enough to save everyone. She jumps happily, agreeing with him. The next day, in the dungeon of Abellio, on the lower floors, a level 20 Bob-Goblin was attacking the protagonist. However, he defeats them easily. Rudy says that just as the scouts told them, they still need to go down about 5 more floors, but no one mentioned that the miasma was spreading this far. The elf girl says that this just shows how fast it's spreading, since even their purification items are having trouble clearing the miasma. They look down the hallway, and the protagonist says it doesn't look like the monsters on the lower floors are still alive. Rudy points out that they still don't know how many floors they'll have to go through and asks her if she wants to stop. She cuts him off and says no. Alicia says that the protagonist's attributes might not work against the monsters, and even if she has to fight up close, she'll manage to land a few hits. Besides, if she runs away and leaves another friend behind, she'll never forgive herself. Rudy apologizes for making her say that again. He touches her and starts using his skill with a big smile. He says he'll use substitution on her miasma status. She looks at him. The protagonist explains that he was already expecting it, and that every time he touches her, he can remove the effects. But as soon as he lets go, the miasma slowly starts to build up again. She smiles and says that if that's the case, the elf girl takes his hand and happily says they just need to hold hands. Smiling, she says she can barely see her feet because of all the miasma, so besides using substitution, he should also guide her. Rudy smiles and says he understands. The two of them start walking happily through the dungeon. Sometime later, they reach the middle floors. The deeper they went, the more miasma there was. Rudy says he used localization and that there are 2 monsters up ahead. Alicia says that if these monsters have been able to withstand all this miasma, they must be strong opponents. Rudy agrees and adds that he's never seen monsters like them before. The elf girl asks if there's any way to avoid them. The protagonist says yes, but that he wants to fight the 2 of them. She looks at him and asks if Rudy wants to eat them. He says that's not it, although he is a little curious. The protagonist says he wants to test out the sword before facing the miasma dragon. A little further ahead, they encounter both monsters. They are level 33 rolling beetles with high stats. Rudy starts using his magic between the monsters. The ground begins to crack, and, suddenly, earth spikes shoot up from the ground, throwing the monsters away. The elf girl is impressed, but the attack doesn't have much of an effect. One of the beetles gets angry, curls up, and starts rolling towards them. Rudy asks Alicia if she can stop the attack, and she says yes, but she'll have to let go of his hand for a moment. The elf girl summons Nomi and shouts to catch it. She begins to use her earth magic, creating a giant hand that grabs the beetle. Alicia tells the protagonist to act fast, as she won't be able to hold on for long. Rudy moves forward and says it's time to test his new weapon. He begins to imbue it with his mana. The sword becomes desperate as the protagonist tells it no, dares to break. A few seconds later, he's ready and charges forward, delivering a blow that slices through everything in front of him. The beetle falls to the ground wounded, but Rudy isn't happy with the result, since the attack wasn't strong enough. The monster begins to scream in front of him, and he raises his sword thinking that if he couldn't put enough power into it, he would have to take a risk another way. Rudy calls out to the elf girl, who smiles, saying she understands everything. The beetle begins to attack and Alicia unleashes her magic as well. The protagonist uses the sword to absorb the elf girl's attack. The sword begins to absorb everything and becomes fully charged. The beetle is already quite close, and just as Rudy is about to be hit, he tells the sword it's time to show everything it's got. With a single blow, the monster is completely defeated. What's left of the monster begins to fall to the ground, and the protagonist looks at what he just did. Looking back, the other beetle trembles in fear, but its end is inevitable. Rudy unleashes a brutal attack that finishes off the last monster, and with both of them defeated, he returns to the elf and praises her for her perfect control over her magic. She smiles and says that everything went well. Rudy takes her hand and uses the substitution skill to remove the accumulated miasma once more. He asks if he can take a little more, but Alicia doesn't understand what he means. The protagonist tries to explain that absorbing her magic didn't restore all of his internal mana. She says that means he's going to eat the monsters. Rudy says he wouldn't do that there. He would simply take a few pieces and bring them with him. As he walks, the protagonist cooks a piece of meat with his magic, begins to eat, and says it has a unique flavor. Alicia asks him how it was using the sword, and Rudy says that once the sword absorbed enough magic, his physical abilities improved drastically. She points out that the most important thing is that the sword wouldn't break even if he poured mana into it. The protagonist says that what worries him is that, according to reports, the miasma dragon is larger than a tree. He wonders how effective his new sword will be, since in terms of weight, his old sword was better. The sword looks around and asks the protagonist for something. Rudy is confused, but it keeps asking. The protagonist asks if it wants to eat meat, but the sword says no. She says she wants the magic stone, so he goes over to the monster and starts looking for the stone. As soon as he finds it, he hands it over to the sword, which grabs the stone and begins to absorb it. After it finishes consuming the stone, it begins to emanate an aura. Rudy sees the transformation and is happy, saying that the sword got much bigger. The elf asks him how he knew what to do, and the protagonist explains that the sword was the one who told him. The sword begins to laugh after being praised, and the protagonist wonders if she got upset when he said she was weaker than his previous one. Rudy says he now understands how the sword works. Alicia says that's good, because the next floor is where the dragon was last seen. Suddenly, they hear a very loud roar that makes everything shake. Alicia asks if that was the dragon's roar. The ceiling begins to crack, and Rudy notices, shouting that the ceiling is going to collapse unless they support it with earth magic. The elf says that if they only try to protect themselves, that the stairs will be blocked and they will lose the chance to fight the dragon. She calls on Faith, saying that in that case, before everything collapses, they will try to cross. Alicia starts to fly, dragging the protagonist with her. Everything starts to break and fall, and as they fly, both feel anxious because the floor keeps compressing more and more. At last, they can see the end of the stairs, and as soon as they pass, an explosion occurs right behind them. However, they manage to arrive safely. Rudy says he thought that was the end. The elf smiles and says she used a lot of magic for that. As soon as they look ahead, they realize the floor is darker than the others. The protagonist says he can use thermal vision as they walk slowly, looking out for enemies. He uses his vision and notices something at the back of the floor. He says it looks like there's something very large on the other side. That's the Miasma Dragon. Its level is 75, with stats superior to any other monster they have seen, and it possesses a wide variety of skills. Rudy says the dragon's level is 75, but its agility isn't very high. Although its vitality is over 500, he asks about its skills. He says the dragon has poisonous fangs and claws. Suddenly, they hear another extremely loud noise. The dragon has noticed their presence. Alicia shouts and asks what its resistances are. Rudy says they are fire, earth, and darkness. She says she will use other attributes and asks him to be her vanguard. The dragon reaches them, and the protagonist shouts that it's time for the great battle. The dragon keeps roaring and spitting miasma everywhere. Rudy thinks he wants to keep his distance and better analyze its attack patterns, but in the midst of such thick miasma, he can't tell how much Alicia can withstand, so he wants to end this as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he notices something in the middle of the miasma. A light starts to grow stronger out of nowhere. The dragon launches a fire blast. He manages to dodge it using instantaneous step. The attack destroys everything it touches. Alicia is in shock, as the attack managed to melt the pillar on the floor. The ambient temperature rises non-stop as the dragon doesn't stop its fire attack. It keeps shooting at the protagonist, who just runs to dodge it. The elf girl sees her companion in danger and asks Alfieri to help him. She manages to use magic on Rudy's feet, drastically increasing his movement speed. With this, he manages to land an attack on the monster. As he looks back, he sees that it only caused a small wound, as the dragon's scales are too hard. Rudy believes he won't be able to injure the dragon with his sword. Furthermore, the magic he used also had no effect. He shouts and calls out to Alicia. She begins to attack. Two blades of air strike directly, but she can't believe what she's seeing. Even with spirit magic, they barely did any damage to the dragon. The monster starts to move its tail and several spikes begin to emerge from it. Both are surprised by this. With a single movement, the dragon breaks a pillar and shoots several spikes at them. Alicia tries to protect herself with her shield, while the protagonist uses his iron body to absorb the blows. He thinks that the dragon has a strong defense and long-range attacks. How would they manage to defeat it? The elf girl shouts and asks the protagonist to buy them some time. He's confused, but she explains that before her stats drop, she'll use her special attack. Rudy understands and gets ready, and the dragon watches them as she casts her magic. As soon as the monster notices, it prepares to attack her. The protagonist uses his earth magic and several hands begin to emerge, striking the dragon. He takes advantage of this opening and jumps to attack, and Rudy manages to land a good hit on the nose of the dragon, forcing its attack downward. Alicia continues casting her magic and thinks she'll be left exposed, so she'll entrust her defense to the protagonist. This way she'll do her part and use all her power in the attack. She summons another spirit named Salim. Rudy continues to fight and distract the dragon, and the water spirit or another appears. The protagonist continues his efforts, while the elf girl gathers all the spirits with her. Nomia and Walken also appear. The dragon notices this, but the magic is almost ready. Desperate, the dragon turns towards her and begins to attack with everything it has. The attack quickly heads in her direction, but at the last second, Rudy steps forward and uses the sword to absorb the entire attack. Alicia yells that it's ready and asks him to get out of the way. He smiles and steps aside, and the elf girl begins her attack using her technique called Spirit Quintet. A powerful wave of energy is released, aimed at the dragon. As soon as the attack lands, it causes a massive explosion in front of them. Already weakened by the miasma, she says that in the past she could have taken down the dragon with a single shot. Through the smoke, the dragon begins to emerge. Its body was covered in numerous wounds, but it was still standing. Rudy touches her shoulder and tells her that she did an excellent job, but now it's his turn to have some fun. Parts of the dragon begin to fall off, as it's severely injured. Alicia apologizes for making him use the substitution again, since she used all her magic in the last attack. She asks him to use what he has left to protect himself, because from now on, the rest is up to him. She begins to use magic on herself and tells him to be careful. Rudy faces the dragon which, despite its wounds, stares at him intently. The monster lets out a deafening roar, but the protagonist takes a deep breath and roars back. The dragon is confused by such a roar, and Rudy stomps on the ground with so much force that it begins to crack. He leaps with incredible speed. The dragon tries to hit him, but the protagonist's mobility is too high. The dark magic he absorbed seems to have infused the sword with a new kind of power. Rudy smiles and continues moving at high speed, brimming with energy. The dragon moves and its scales begin to fall off, and the protagonist notices this and says that it's now easier to cut. He speeds up his movements even more and begins to attack the dragon from various angles. As he attacks, he realizes that the sword is becoming less effective, as the mana it absorbed is running out. Injured and irritated, the dragon glares at the protagonist and releases another wave of miasma, throwing him back. He thinks that even though the miasma doesn't affect him, the shockwave still pushes him. The monster doesn't waste any time and uses the distance to attack again with its spikes. Rudy thinks he can't dodges it and uses Flash Step. This allows him to avoid the spikes. The dragon uses its arm to attack him. With no time to evade, the protagonist is hit and uses his iron body along with his sword to defend himself. However, the attack is extremely powerful and throws him against the wall with a terrifying crash. Rudy screams in pain, thinking he's figured out the distance the dragon covers with Flash Step. His vision starts to blur. He admits that dragons are truly incredible. The monster begins to approach him. Despite having no strength left, Alicia cries out for her companion. Rudy remembers the first time he almost died, the fight against the Minotaur, and falling into the pit. He gathers his strength and says, "This time is different." Using his earth ability, he creates a hand that launches him upward. He thinks his past self can't compare to who he is now. Rudy prepares himself and begins to fall toward the dragon, which sees him coming and prepares a new attack. The protagonist believes the dragon will use its breath again, and perhaps he could avoid it with web manipulation, but if he keeps dodging like this, he'll lose a battle of attrition. Rudy decides that it's better to use the webs as a slingshot to attack. He gains momentum and launches himself toward the dragon, which fires its power with all its might. They both attack each other. Rudy begins to absorb the attack with his sword. As he does, he thinks there's nothing he can do against the heat. However, he can still absorb the mana contained in the attack. If his fire resistance is enough to withstand it, then he can reinforce the weapon with more mana and combine it with all the mana the sword has already absorbed, releasing it all at once. He continues without hesitation, and, although the attack is powerful, the protagonist holds his ground with his sword. The amount of mana and heat is overwhelming and becomes more unbearable with each passing second, until suddenly he is enveloped in a layer of water. From a distance, the elf girl shouts for him to hurry. Since the heat no longer bothers him, he can now move freely. Rudy shouts, "Thanks," and gathers all his accumulated power, delivering a devastating blow that strikes the dragon directly. The sound of the impact echoes throughout the entire dungeon. The dragon meets its end. Rudy smiles as this intense battle concludes, falling to the ground with no energy left. Alicia runs to him and says she'll heal him right away. Rudy raises his hand and tells her that she doesn't need to overdo it. He begins to use his leech skill, and all the dragon's plasma starts to exit its body and gathers in his hand. Rudy says that this way he can recover a little. After a brief recovery, he collapses on the ground and says it's time for a break. The elf girl is standing by his side. He holds out his hand and calls her Alicia. She is delighted by this and runs to take his hand. As soon as they touch, he uses substitution once more. They lie down next to each other and he says they finally did it. Alicia takes a deep breath and says yes, they finally did it. She turns to him and asks if this is just the beginning. The protagonist smiles and says yes. He remembers the S-rank adventurer who saved him. That person was much stronger than he is now. Rudy sighs and says they still have a long way to go. He gets up and says that, first of all, he needs to get some dragon meat. Afterward, they begin to descend deeper into the dungeon. They open a door, and the protagonist is stunned by what he sees. In front of them is a magic circle with a sphere behind it. That is the dungeon core. The elf says that even among adventurers, it's rare to see this, and if they use the circle on the core, they will be teleported directly to the dungeon's entrance, returning instantly. The two of them approach the core, and Alicia explains that it's normal to leave the core intact, since they take materials from the dungeon that don't exist on the surface. Rudy says that if they leave it here, one day the Miasma Dragon will be resurrected. He begins to reach for his sword, thinking that Abellio's dungeon was where he had his worst experience, but it was because of everything he endured there that he was able to open a door to fulfill his dream. The protagonist raises his sword, and thanking the dungeon for everything it has done for his life, with a single strike he shatters the core, and a bright light fills the room. Meanwhile, at the guild headquarters, everyone is gathered. Lancaster asks if anyone has heard anything from Rudy's party. A young woman replies that, unfortunately, they haven't received any news of their return. The master lowers his head and says he understands. He starts to think that he always knew that in the world of adventurers, they called him the Miasma Butcher. Power is everything, and that's why, even if Lancaster tried to mediate the situation, it would never stop, because the life of a powerless adventurer is harsh and difficult. But if this was enough to make the protagonist give up on his dreams, then it was just another path to walk. Suddenly, a person comes running into the room, saying they have something to report. The guild master is surprised, and the man says that Rudy and Alicia have just returned using the magic circle. He points out that the tasks of subduing the dragon and destroying the dungeon core have been completed. Lancaster is stunned to hear this. Everyone in the room begins to cheer and celebrate this victory, except for the guild master, who is still frozen from hearing the news. He starts to smile, saying he couldn't believe that out of all the adventurers, Rudy would be the one to save the city. Lancaster stands up and says they should go greet them. Those two are the adventurers with the power to change their destiny. The protagonist and the elf girl are happy to see the whole celebration. Elsewhere, in a city called Golem, a man receives a letter that makes him angry with the city of Bolia. The old man got angry and said that Bolia has so many dungeons that they destroy the core of one of them without a second thought. He threw the paper down and shouted that his plan to take over the new dungeon was ruined. A young man asked if that wasn't a good thing. He explained that Bolia couldn't deny Gold's legitimate right to the new dungeon, which is why they destroyed it. If they used this story, they could demand that Bolia compensate them for the profits they could have made from the dungeon. The Lord thought it would be better to profit this way than to challenge the dungeon and lose adventurers. However, if they did that, the Bolia Adventurers Guild wouldn't stay silent. The young man replied that this was exactly what they wanted. This way, they could show that old man and his team who was truly superior. Night fell and I still feel, who was looking at the birds. Rudy and the elf girl were camping. The protagonist was preparing the dragon steak, which was extremely rare. Alicia started salivating again, saying the smell was incredible. Rudy smiled and said it had been at the bottom of his bag for quite some time. He had taken it from the dragon and was finally able to eat it. As soon as the meat was ready, he cut off a piece and started eating. The protagonist was amazed by the taste, saying it was delicious. He commented that this meat made any piece of meat he had eaten before seem mediocre. The sweet flavor of the meat was exquisite and the fat melted in his mouth. Along with the taste of the red meat, it was perfect. Alicia was eager to eat. She stood up and said that it was decided. With honor and courage, She proclaimed that tonight they would eat prize-winning meat. Rudy shouted that he was already eating. She got irritated and called him selfish. Meanwhile, Sylphid was relaxing and the elf girl was yelling at the protagonist, telling him they needed to go back soon and find a good restaurant. After the destruction of the Abellio dungeon, some reports were being written days ago and the guild master apologized for calling them there so many times, but he assured them this would be the last. He informed Rudy and Elfin that the report on the raid had finally been confirmed. Alcars then took out a bag full of money and said that this was the reward for both of them, worth 150 million reen. The protagonist was shocked and shouted, asking if that was really the correct amount. The master explained that the average level requirement for the Abellio dungeon was 70, so this was the appropriate reward. Rudy looked at the huge sum, astonished by the amount of money. Lancaster called the protagonist and explained that since he and Alicia had conquered the dungeon alone, he couldn't leave him at D rank. As part of the reward, the protagonist would also be promoted. In another room, some adventurers were going about their lives as usual. The protagonist started walking among them and mentioned that although he had recently been promoted to D rank, he had already reached level 52, opening his status card to show it. He commented on how quickly he had reached that level. Elfin was impressed and pointed out that even though the protagonist was facing monsters far above his level, he was still leveling up at an abnormal rate. She thought that normally, once someone reached level 40, their leveling speed would decrease drastically. Suddenly, he looked at the protagonist who was laughing in her face and said that he had finally surpassed her level and hit abs. Alicia opened her own status, showing she was level 45. Elfin frowned and said it wasn't funny. Rudy, on the other hand, pointed out that it was strange because although his level was higher as far as combat power was concerned, Alicia had much more strength. Alicia boasted, saying that level was just an indicator and, in the end, combat power depended on each person's skills and experience. Rudy then watched the door distractedly when a group of men, accompanied by a bald old man, entered. The man started to laugh, saying he was surprised to see the famous Miasma butcher from the rumors. Rudy got nervous and asked who he was, pointing out that education had apparently passed him by. The old man continued to laugh and said that the adventurers from Bologna didn't even know the lord of the neighboring city. Rudy was surprised to realize that if this man was the lord of the neighboring city, he must be the greedy lord of Gola. The lord then asked how they dared to destroy the dungeon and questioned if the dungeon wasn't theirs to enter. Rudy replied that the last he heard, the Abellio dungeon belonged to everyone. The old man explained that the dungeon was on the border between Bologna and Gola, but that Bologna, being so petty, had driven them out, claiming that something strange was happening there. Furthermore, they had caused a monster stampede and, in the end, had destroyed the dungeon. The people started to get angry, but the Lord continued to wonder how they were going to compensate for the lost profits from the dungeon and the damage caused by the monsters in Gola. Alicia stepped forward and asked the Lord to calm down, explaining that such matters should be discussed between guild representatives. She also pointed out that there had been no reports of monsters invading Gola's territory and that the adventurers of Bologna had already handled the situation, so they had no right to complain. The Lord became angry, unable to argue with her. Rudy looked at Alicia with pride, thinking that this was what was expected of an S-rank adventurer, someone who knew how to use their words well. Suddenly, the guild master of Gola, a blonde idiot, began to speak, saying that the Emerald Storm, named Alicia, had affiliated with Bologna and that it made sense for someone as trashy as her to join such a place. Rudy got angry, thinking that this scoundrel was the guild master of Gola. The blonde man continued, saying that this was not a matter for mere adventurers to interfere in. The Lord was thrilled by these words and, as he passed by her, he commented that she was just a useless survivor of a party that sacrificed itself for nothing and that she should stop interfering where she wasn't wanted. He called her useless trash. Upon hearing this, Alicia began to lose control and unleashed a huge amount of aura, frightening everyone. The blonde idiot was shocked and thought that he had been intimidated by a girl below level 45. Suddenly, Lancaster shouted for everyone to stop. Alicia began to control her aura, but she didn't take her eyes off the blonde man. Then, the guild master of Bologna shouted, saying he would not tolerate fighting in the guild, and asked the lord and the other guild master to accompany him. The blonde man started to laugh and said that Lancaster should keep his dogs on a leash. Rudy asked who that piece of trash thought he was. Suddenly, another person appeared out of nowhere, asking if Alicia remembered him. The protagonist, and annoyed, asked what was going on now, since someone kept showing up all the time. As soon as Alicia saw the man, she remembered he was Egbert. He took her hand and asked if she remembered him. The protagonist felt a little uncomfortable and asked if she knew him. Alicia explained that Egbert had been part of an old team she used to adventure with. The elf began to say that back then he greatly admired ore trails, not to mention that the elf could use several magic spirits at the same time and how she fought. As an elf, he couldn't help but see her as an inspiration. Then, he pointed out that he knew how much she had suffered, and that's why he came to Bellona. Everett stared at her and asked if she would like to join his party. Alicia stared at him. Meanwhile, the protagonist started to get even more irritated seeing this. Everett continued to look at her, waiting for an answer. Alicia thanked him for the offer, but she refused it, saying she was already part of a party. She said this was her partner, and the protagonist held out his hand, introducing himself as Rudy. However, Everett slapped his hand away, surprising them both. The protagonist remained irritated as Everett held the elf's hand and said that he knew what had happened in the Abyssal Dungeon and that she had been cursed, but he couldn't believe that an S-rank adventurer like her would end up in a situation where she'd be forced to party up with someone called the Butcher of Miasma. Rudy got even angrier. Everett continued, saying that if she joined his party, they would make better use of her skills and experience. She slapped his hand away angrily, telling him to stop saying things he knew nothing about. Alicia explained that she partied up with Rudy because she wanted to, and that any insult against him was a direct insult to her. She emphasized that she appreciated his concern, but the curse cast on her had already been broken. Everett was stunned and said that the curse on her had come from the Abyssal Dungeon, which was rank SS and, on top of that, was caused by a boss from that area. Alicia turned away and said she just got lucky. He stood there, not believing what he had heard, while the elf girl winked at the protagonist, thinking it would be bad if his abilities became public, so she preferred to keep it a secret. He smiled and thanked her. Alicia then mentioned that she would update the ranks now, and the protagonist was no longer D rank, but was now C rank. Everett was horrified, wondering why this was happening, especially since he had spent all that time thinking about her. Suddenly, he started to get irritated, thinking that it was Rudy who had influenced Alicia. He started to look at them both and wondered how a D-rank adventurer could have defeated the Miasma Dragon. However, the story would change if Alicia's curse had really been broken. Everett thought that it was she who had defeated the dragon and that the protagonist was stealing the credit. Rudy noticed a strange aura coming from the elf and told Eleanor that the guy was looking at him like a lunatic. She explained that elves were very proud and held grudges that grew throughout their lives. The protagonist stared at her, and Alicia asked him what he wanted. Rudy smiled and said that she was also an elf and asked if she was also a proud and prejudiced elf. She responded by asking what he meant, as she considered herself a very humble, intelligent, and charming elf. What she lacked in cuteness, she made up for with strength. Rudy thought that she really was proud of it. The receptionist said she heard everything from the guild master, smiled, and handed a paper to the protagonist, saying this was a rare occurrence. When Rudy looked at it, he was surprised to find that it was a guild certificate confirming that he was now B rank. The receptionist explained that he skipped C rank, straight to B, and they both start to celebrate. He adds that this shows how difficult the task of conquering the Abyssal Dungeon was. He also mentions that they received a report from the town they saved, which indicates that they also recognize their victory against Baphomet. The protagonist looks at the certificate and says he finally has a B rank. Suddenly, someone taps Rudy on the back, saying that if it were him, he'd be even happier. After all, everyone in the city is grateful to him. Magnus and Rygert were there together, smiling. The protagonist gets excited to see them there. Alicia calls out to him and says he can't be too happy with his B rank. After all, what he's really aiming for is. Rudy sighs and says she's right. Happily, he slaps himself on the face and shouts that it's okay and that he will rise to S rank. Everett then starts calling out to him and asks if he really thinks something so stupid like that will be allowed. Rudy asks him what he's talking about. Everett says that exploring dungeons requires a specific rank, a rule that ensures safety, but a man who only achieves something by following others gets a rank B. Everett looks at him with contempt and says the Bullia Guild is made up of idiots. All the adventurers present there get nervous. Rudy asks what he means. The receptionist says it doesn't matter what he thinks, because the ranks are given according to the guild's will. Magnus approaches Everett and asks if he's going to take back what he said or if he wants to get hurt. However, the elf starts laughing and says that they're all actually idiots. Magnus grabs him and starts insulting him. Alicia yells at him to stop, but with a simple movement, Everett throws Magnus. He falls to the ground and the elf stabs his sword into the floor next to him. With an arrogant tone, Everett asks Magnus if he can stop touching him with those dirty hands. Elfin shouts and tells Everett to stop immediately. He says that she has always been too kind to people, to the point of associating with such a deplorable man. She asks why that would be wrong. Everett admits that elves are prejudiced and says he finds it difficult to change his mind once he's made a decision. He starts to smile and says that even an elf as humble, intelligent, and charming as himself, as a fellow elf, must show her the right path. Rudy bursts out laughing and Everett asks him what he's laughing at. The protagonist thinks that they are both too proud. The elf says he already knows how to solve this, since incompetent adventurers are a danger to others. Then, he says he will test him to see if he really is worthy of being B rank. The receptionist asks him why he's deciding these things on his own, but Alicia replies that it's fine. She shouts that if Ivert doubts the protagonist's abilities, he can see them with his own eyes. They head to the Bologna Guild's training area. Alicia apologizes to Rudy and tells him that things ended up this way because of her. He smiles and says it's not just her fault, but also his own incompetence. Rudy says he just needs to defeat that idiot elf and prove he's worthy of being with her. He starts to laugh, saying that, in the end, adventurers can only shut others up with violence. People start to gather to watch the duel. Alicia shouts that if either of them gets hurt, she will intervene immediately. They get ready and the signal is given. Everett charges forward with all his strength. Rudy is surprised by his speed, but manages to block the attack. The elf smiles and says that the protagonist managed to stop the attack, so he's at least somewhat decent. Everett keeps attacking again and again. Rudy feels pressured, thinking that the elf is better than him at swordsmanship. He also heard Alicia say that Everett uses both offensive magic and strengthening magic to fight. He's an arcane swordsman. Suddenly, Everett disappears and appears behind the protagonist, launching a strike that grazes Rudy. But he's not satisfied with the attack. Rudy keeps looking at Everett, thinking that he's not able to keep up with the pace of his movements. He needs to use his skills to win, but if he does, the elf starts saying that he is rank B and that title is only for those with the strength to wield it. Everett asks if the protagonist understands that he is not worthy of carrying the rank B title or of being by Alicia's side. Rudy admits that the elf is right. With the skills he currently has, he is not worthy of being by her side. However, she was the one who chose him, and that's why he will prove here and now that he deserves to be by her side. Alicia smiles upon hearing this, but Everett does not. Rudy starts to use his earth magic and a giant hand emerges towards the elf. Everett starts to laugh and curses, the protagonist asking if he really thinks he will defeat an elf using magic. He shoots a fireball at Rudy's magic. When they collide, a powerful explosion occurs. The people watching get scared and shout that they are going too far. Everett starts to create a new spell and says it's a shame for the Miasma Butcher. A large amount of energy begins to gather on the ceiling of the room. The elf says that is the difference between their ranks. Everett attacks, shouting at Farah to bow before him. The protagonist prepares to receive the blow. As all that energy hits his sword, it immediately begins to be absorbed. The people are confused by this. Everett is surprised, while Rudy says he knew the elf would try to use magic to defeat him. After all, elves are a proud race. The sword is overflowing with energy. Quickly, Rudy charges forward to attack. Everett manages to defend himself. The two begin to exchange blows, and the elf thinks that Rudy's speed and strength are on a completely different level than before. He shouts, asking if that sword is a magic sword. The protagonist replies that he is wrong, as that sword is. Everett backs away in confusion. He curses Rudy, saying that this is just another reason not to let Alicia be with him. Everett starts to use his magic, activating his lightning enchantment and his arcane swordsmanship skill. The lightning bolts begin to come out of his body as he shouts that Rudy won't be able to match his speed. Like a flash of lightning, he rushes forward, landing a blow on the protagonist. It's the lightning palm. The people are shocked. Everett starts to smile, saying that in the end, the protagonist is just trash. He asks Elvina to announce the winner, but still, nothing is decided. Rudy grabs him by the shirt and starts to laugh, apologizing, but the shock doesn't affect him. Everett shouts and says that's impossible because he should have been paralyzed by such a high voltage. He headbutts him, making him scream. Everett falls to the ground as Rudy stabs his sword into the ground beside him. The protagonist says he didn't mean any harm by it, but that lately he's been getting a bit tougher with the falls. The adventurers start to cheer and Alicia smiles at the result. They begin to enter the arena, saying it's over. Meanwhile, in Landkar's office, he was explaining that the feudal lord was handling some matters in the capital and that he was acting as his substitute. Landkar says he understood Goliath's claims, and that since they were in charge of management, they intended to cooperate with the recovery efforts. The lord says he already knows that, emphasizing that they want compensation, not cooperation, and they want a fair share of the dungeon. Since Valona got greedy and took more than she should have, now they must pay the price. Suddenly, a girl bursts into the room. The Golem Guild master asks her what's going on, since she didn't even knock. The young woman shouts that it's an emergency and something strange is happening with the new Abellio dungeon, which they had already confirmed as completely destroyed. There is a strange energy and some things are happening. The girl says the area around it is covered in dense mana, and the concentration is B rank. Landkars shouts that this is impossible, adding that 2 gargoyles guard the entrance and block any external interference. Lankars says that as for Gollum, the visitors don't think it's the right time to entertain such useless rumors. The two get irritated hearing this. The leader stands up and says they will organize a subjugation force to leave immediately. He orders the young woman to summon any B rank or higher adventurers, and especially that rude bunch must be included in the raid. All the adventurers are summoned to the Master's Hall. Lankar begins to explain the current situation. They have just confirmed that the dungeon cycle has begun, and they will head immediately to the Abellio dungeon to subjugate it as quickly as possible. Rudy asks what that means, and Alicia explains that the cycle is something like an evolution within the dungeon, but it's something very rare. She has only heard of it a few times. She says that this time it occurred due to the collapse of the dungeons and that it's the first time she's facing it. The Alpha gets worried, since the mana concentration around the area is B rank. The protagonist says that they are also B rank, and besides, there are some high-ranking individuals, so it's not a problem. Suddenly, Everett calls out to the protagonist again and tells him it's understandable, since until recently he was D rank, so Rudy doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. The protagonist asks him what he means. The elf explains that if the mana concentration around the dungeon is B rank, inside the dungeon it could be at least A rank or, in the worst-case scenario, S rank. Alicia adds that, from what she's heard, the dungeon is constantly evolving like a cocoon. She explains that when the cocoon hatches, the surface will be flooded. Nearby, there's a possibility that both will suffer catastrophic damage. The protagonist starts to think about his city. Suddenly, the master approaches him and tells him not to worry. There have been few cases of dungeon cycles, and there's still a lot of mystery surrounding this phenomenon, so it might not be as serious as it seems. Lancaster shows confidence and says that Rudy is the one who cleared the dungeon, so he would trust him to lead the others. Rudy feels a little less worried, while Delphina feels proud of him. Sometime later, at the entrance of the dungeons, the 2 gargoyles are standing guard. People are watching from a distance. Rudy uses his eye to analyze them. He sees that they are both at level 50 and reports that they are slightly stronger than the beetles they faced. Suddenly, someone kicks a stone, causing a noise. That's enough for the gargoyles to hear. Rudy thinks they are in trouble now. The 2 monsters begin to attack the group. One of them uses petrifying breath. Alicia calls out to the society and orders it to dispel the magic, causing both spells to collide in midair. The other adventurers are impressed, but the attack isn't over yet. The other gargoyle charges forward, but the guild leader punches it in the head, causing it to sink into the ground. He gets angry and curses at the monster, calling it an insect. The remaining gargoyle also attacks the leader. Ramon smiles and finishes off the monster with a single attack. The 2 guild leaders resolve the problem effortlessly. Rudy is impressed by their strength. Lancaster says it's time to hurry, since they don't have any time to waste. The protagonist steps over the other gargoyles and thinks they look edible. He begins to burn the flesh. Ramon asks him what he's doing, and Rudy replies that the monster has regenerative abilities, so he's going to finish it off. Ramon turns around and starts to leave, while the protagonist stuffs some meat into his bag. Inside the dungeon, they observe that there doesn't seem to be as much miasma as before and that the nature of the dungeon has changed. Rudy says the layout hasn't changed much, but Alicia says they can't let their guard down because they don't know what's happening on the lower floors. She emphasizes that even though the layout hasn't changed, the monsters will be more powerful than before. The group encounters some monsters up ahead. Lancaster says the big one is his, while the others can pick any of the smaller ones to take on. Ramon uses his skill, Warrior's Honor, and the adventurers receive a magic that enhances their attacks. The monsters charge, but the adventurers start defeating them with ease. Delphina gets excited and calls out to the protagonist, Rudy, to join them too. When she looks at him, the protagonist is irritated, as his abnormal status nullification canceled out the Warrior's Honor skill he had received as a buff. Lancaster starts to take his weapon out of his bag and, with the help of Ramon's aura, is ready for battle. The monster begins to attack him, but the guild master notices an opening and, with a single blow, ends the fight. Rudy remains standing while the others continue to fight. Athena keeps watching him. He's still irritated because his unique skill also nullifies support magic. More monsters start to appear. The metal-headed one says he will gather them all and uses his taunt skill to draw the attention of all the nearby monsters. They attack the adventurer, who starts to laugh and uses his interception barrier. He yells, shouting for his comrades to attack now. The 2 of them quickly rush into battle. Egbert, with his incredible speed, defeats everyone who crosses his path. The girl known as X-23 also attacks the monsters, defeating them with ease. She says that these monsters are difficult to analyze, as it's not easy to find their weaknesses. One of the mages named Titus shouts that they should attack with everything they have and they'll resolve the situation. He and Milam attack together and manage to clear the area. Ramon observes all of this. The The metal-headed one says that their taunting will soon be over and warns everyone to be careful. However, the ground beneath their feet begins to crack and a huge monster appears in front of him. The monster grabs him, making him scream that there was one underground. But with a precise attack, Milam destroys the monster. Axe turns around and says the attack almost hit him, asking her to be more careful next time. The protagonist observes all this and thinks that they are strong, and on top of that, their teamwork is perfect, which makes it hard to believe they are a makeshift group. He starts to get irritated because he hasn't been able to help at all. Some wounded monsters look at the body of the larger monster and begin to fuse with each other. Rudy notices this and thinks that, in fact, these smaller monsters are just parasites. The protagonist gets excited, thinking that now is his moment and begins to use earth magic. The two mages watch. Rudy fires his attack at the monster, but it creates a magic circle that absorbs the stone magic. Rudy is impressed and uses his eye to analyze the situation. He sees that the monster has earth-manipulating abilities and its nature is composed of rubble and earth. Ramon comes up behind the monster and defeats it with a single move, saying that the best way to deal with a parasite is to always hit it in the head. Ramon comments that, even so, he never imagined that Rudy would use earth magic against a monster that came from the ground. He says that's a huge blunder, not to mention that the protagonist even undermined the honor of the warriors. Rudy feels uncomfortable with this, thinking that he's right as he lacks experience working in such a diverse group and can't rely on the magical support of his teammates. This makes him feel like he's nothing more than a burden. Suddenly, Everett calls out to him, questioning if he's not able to keep up with the pace of the battle. He says that teamwork should be the foundation for any adventurer and that, although the protagonist may think he won, in the end he's not suited for this group. Everett realizes that both Rudy and Elfina are already at their limits with him. However, a huge explosion occurs that catches everyone's attention. They shout for ground vehicles, but he replies that it's fine. The master then says that the most important thing is that the monster has been parasitized by the bodies of its own kind. Lankar says that the creature's wounds have regenerated, and furthermore, its combat power has increased. Ramon sarcastically says that thanks to this, now they only have to deal with one monster. He jokes that he'll give a little help to the needy, but then he feels something sting him. He slaps the ground, and when he looks, he is horrified by what he sees, which is a monster. Ramon starts turning to stone, thinking their main goal was for the insects to inject them with poison. Petrified, they are affected by the mosquitoes and the monster is now free to attack them. In just a few seconds, the entire group is completely petrified. The monster approaches them, creating a sword in its hand, preparing to deliver the final blow. Lancaster accepts his fate and says it's a shame, but at the last second, Rudy uses his web manipulation and manages to pull him out of the attack just in time. The monster is confused, as the protagonist had rescued everyone in his group thanks to his unique ability that prevents anything from affecting him. Rudy starts to laugh and says that now is his moment. He touches Alicia and frees her. Alicia is happy and thanks him, and the protagonist replies that it's time to act. He uses his eye again and realizes that the monster is level 66. He tells her that the monster has no protection against magic, so she must attack and break its stance, and then he will do the rest. Alicia calls upon her spirits and begins attacking with everything she has. The monster sees the attack, but it can't dodge and is hit directly, falling to the ground. But both Rudy and Alicia are confused as the monster's face changes positions and begins to reshape, taking on a different form. Athena says it's disgusting. The beast sends multiple insects to attack, but Rudy pushes her away and shouts that this time he's going to blow them all up at once. He uses his lightning cloak and takes out all the insects. Lancaster, even though he has turned to stone, watches the scene, but can't do anything. The monster starts to move to attack again, and the two of them prepare for another battle. Alicia gathers her magic and hits the monster with an earth attack, sending it flying. Rudy uses instant step to move forward and attack. The beast, now high in the air, begins to change shape once more and spins, managing to dodge the attack. Rudy gets irritated. The monster takes advantage of the protagonist's lowered guard and attacks. The elf Talon shouts for him to be careful. Lancaster moves to his side with incredible speed and lands a powerful blow on the monster, saving Rudy. The attack is so strong that it sends the monster flying, creating a hole in the wall. The protagonist is surprised and asks how Lancaster managed to escape the petrification. Lancaster replies that he circulated magic throughout his body and thanks Rudy for buying him time. The monster begins to get up. Lancaster says they must now end this once and for all. The protagonist asks the master to leave it to him. Rudy begins to imbue his sword with mana. The beast lets out a great roar and attacks them again. The protagonist, with his eyes fixed on the creature's movements, launches a powerful strike that manages to finish off the monster. Parts of the monster begin to fall to the ground. Rudy looks at his sword and thinks that it seems he can now control the amount of mana he injects into it. The monster is in pieces on the ground. Alicia screams, but the protagonist says he already knows, as thorns sprout from his hand. Rudy states that he won't let that darn creature regenerate again. He begins to shoot the poisonous spikes he took from the dragon, hitting the monster that was already on the ground. Each piece of the monster begins to groan in pain. The elf's heart says that the poison degrades faster than its regeneration, adding that if it weren't for the dragon's immunity, the battle against the dragon would have been even more dangerous. Lanx calls out to the protagonist and asks if he plans to reveal his secret to everyone. He looks at everyone and asks what he should do, since he won't be able to get by without a proper explanation. Alicia agrees, saying that besides, they won't be able to keep the secret for much longer. Rudy agrees, but says he needs to heal everyone with a replacement. Sometime later, once everyone is healed, Rudy finishes, telling them everything that happened. Lenka says it's hard to believe, but after seeing the protagonist fight, Everett interrupts the master, saying that this is incredible. Everett takes Rudy's hand and says that in his entire life, this is the first time he has ever witnessed a miracle like that. The protagonist asks if he wasn't the one who said Rudy wasn't fit to be an adventurer. Everett tells the protagonist not to worry about the details, as he now sees that Rudy is worthy of accompanying Alicia. Milan asks if the protagonist can really eat monsters. Rudy is a bit surprised by everyone's reaction and pulls several chunks from his bag and says yes, asking if they would mind if he cooks some up right then.